Hello everyone and welcome back to the Unexplained Diaries. Here on this channel I share real-life encounters with beings from beyond the skies to help you unwind and drift off to sleep. Before we dive in, I would love to hear from you. Leave a comment and let me know where you're tuning in from. Now, find a comfortable spot, relax, and let's begin. I was flying my usual route over the Brooks Range, just past the Dalton Highway stretch, when I first noticed something off. It was late February, dead of winter. Clear skies, perfect flying weather if you like cold enough to crack your face. I'd taken off from Dead Horse early that morning, hauling some gear and mail to a small camp near the foothills. Nothing unusual, just the usual icy tundra and the scattered spruce and birch dotting the landscape. I was cruising at about 3,000 feet when I spotted it out the window. At first, I thought it might be a weather balloon or some kind of drone, but it didn't move. Just hung there over the trees like a goddamn frisbee, perfectly still. It was a flat, disc-shaped object, about maybe 50 feet across, and it was just hovering a few dozen feet above the treetops. No sound. Well, no sound I could hear over the drone of the Twin Otter's engines. I blinked, thinking maybe the glare on the window was messing with me, but it was definitely there. The shape was odd, too smooth and perfectly round, with this dull metallic sheen that didn't reflect the sun like ice or metal usually does. No markings, no lights, nothing. Just a silent disc, hovering like a hovering thing. I circled around it, slow and easy, keeping a steady distance. I watched for maybe 3 or 4 minutes, trying to make sense of it, but it didn't move a centimeter. I grabbed my handheld radio to check in with the station back at Dead Horse, but all I got was static. Nothing else was in the air that morning. No other planes or choppers that I could see or hear. I was more curious than scared at first, but there was this weird feeling like something was watching me, or maybe I was the one being watched. I kept scanning with my handheld magnetometer, something I sometimes use for work near old mining sites. And right when I flew directly over the object, the needle spiked hard to the red zone. I swear, it jumped so fast it almost made me drop the device. That spike was way outside normal. Normally I'd get small fluctuations from the rocks and some sun flare, but nothing like this. My compass was acting weird too. The dial wobbled, then settled back like nothing happened. I double-checked the plane's instruments, but they all seemed fine. Altimeter, airspeed, nothing out of place. After a couple of circuits, I decided to head back to the camp for a better look on foot. Maybe I could catch a better glimpse from the ground or find some sign the thing had been there. I landed on the snow-packed tundra, parked the plane, and started hiking in the direction where I'd seen it. The forest was quiet, the kind of quiet that presses down on you. No birdsong, no animals rustling, nothing. Snow lay thick on the ground, untouched except for my own footprints. I walked carefully, scanning the trees for any sign, broken branches, crushed snow, anything. But there was nothing, no imprint, no sign the object had ever been there. The trees stood straight, their branches heavy with snow, and the ground was smooth like untouched powder. Even the snow beneath where I thought it hovered was completely undisturbed. I circled around for nearly an hour, going off my gut, but I found nothing. I started getting a bit uneasy. The light was fading fast. Sunset comes quick this time of year, and I knew I had to get back before dark. I pulled out my magnetometer again and walked a few paces off the path, scanning the area. The needle jumped again, the same way it had in the air, sharp, sudden, then back to normal. No logical explanation. I took out my phone to call the camp, but there was no signal. Typical for this part of Alaska. As I turned back toward the plane, I noticed a faint glow coming from deeper in the trees, a low, steady light that pulsed just enough to catch my eye. I hesitated, but the cold was biting and the daylight was disappearing fast. I figured it was probably a reflection or maybe some campfires from hunters or trappers. I didn't stick around to find out. Back in the plane, I checked the instruments again. Everything seemed normal now, except that little magnetometer still showing tiny blips. I radioed the tower when I was in range, but they had no reports of anything unusual. No radar contacts, no reports from other pilots. When I got back to Dead Horse that evening, I ran through my logs and checked the plane's onboard sensors. The electromagnetic spike was clear as day, peaked at exactly the moment I flew over that disk. I asked a friend who's a retired Air Force tech to look at the readings, but even he shrugged it off. I said the data looked real, but unexplained. That night, I barely slept. My brain kept running through every possible explanation: secret military tests, some weird weather anomaly, maybe even hallucinations from flying so many hours in isolation. But I know what I saw. The next day, I went back to the spot on foot again, hoping to find a clue I'd missed. Nothing. No prints, no scorch marks, no sign of anything out of place. The trees were still standing, the snow untouched. It was like the thing had never been there at all. I told a few folks in town about it, mostly just to get it off my chest. Some nodded like they'd seen their own strange things out here. One old timer called it a spirit of the land, but I don't buy that. Another guy suggested maybe it was some kind of natural electromagnetic phenomenon, but that didn't explain the shape or the way it hovered. In the weeks that followed, I kept an eye on my instruments and watched the skies whenever I flew out that way. Nothing else showed up. No strange objects, no weird lights, just the endless wilderness and the cold. Sometimes I think about that silent disk, just hanging there over the trees, perfectly still, and watching. I wonder if it's still out there, waiting. But it didn't leave any trace, no sign it was ever close, just that sharp spike on my magnetometer and the memory of something completely out of place in a place where nothing should be. I still fly the Brooks Range routes all the time, and every so often I catch myself glancing out the window, hoping I'm wrong and maybe it was just a trick of light or my imagination. But I know what I saw. My name's Eric Halverson, and I run a small wildlife research outfit near the Yukon River, just outside of Eagle, Alaska. I'm mostly in charge of maintaining the trail cameras we set up to monitor critters: moose, wolves, the usual. Nothing fancy, just your run-of-the-mill remote cameras that snap a few photos or a short clip whenever they catch motion. I'm used to the usual suspects wandering through: deer nibbling on willows, foxes darting by, maybe a lynx if I'm lucky. But what I caught one late fall had me scratching my head for weeks. I don't remember exactly when the trouble started, but I noticed the first oddities in the footage around early October. It was getting dark early, the river was starting to ice over, and I was spending more nights out checking cameras. One spot we'd been monitoring for months, a little clearing by a beaver dam, showed something strange. The first clip was short, only a few seconds. I pulled it up on my laptop back at the cabin. The image was grainy, nothing unusual except for a shadowy figure in the corner. At first, I thought it was just a moose or maybe a lanky dog, but the way it moved didn't add up. It wasn't bounding or trotting like any four-legged animal I knew. Instead, it glided, smooth and deliberate, limbs stretching out longer than anything natural. It moved almost like a shadow puppet, but without the jerky stop-start that most critters show on camera. It was too fluid. What really got me was the way the footage glitched every time the thing got close to the camera. The image would warp, distort like a bad TV signal. It wasn't your usual camera malfunction. This was different, almost like the figure's presence was interfering with the recording. Weird, right? I've been around electronics in the bush long enough to know the difference between busted gear and something else messing with it. After I spotted that clip, I started checking the other cameras nearby. Nothing like that showed up anywhere else, just that one spot. I went out during the day to check it myself, looking for tracks or anything disturbed, broken twigs, footprints, animal scat. But there was nothing. The snow and fallen leaves were untouched, like no one or nothing had been there at all. It didn't track through the clearing, it just appeared on the footage. I figured maybe the camera was picking up some sort of natural optical illusion. Could be the low autumn sun playing tricks through the trees or a weird combination of shadows, but even then, it didn't explain the glitches or the figure's unnatural movement. I told my buddy Jake about it when he came by one afternoon. Jake's a biologist and has been working in the Yukon for years. I showed him the footage and watched his face while I played it back. He was quiet for a while, then shrugged. "Might be some kind of animal nobody's cataloged yet," he said. "But if that's the case, we should be seeing tracks or signs somewhere." We agreed to put up some extra cameras closer together around that clearing, hoping to get a better look. Over the next week, the new cameras collected more clips. The figure showed up again, always at night. I stayed at the cabin most nights, poring over footage. There was something about how it moved, elongated limbs sweeping silently through the underbrush, gliding without a sound. It didn't run, it didn't jump, it just moved, like it was sliding through a dream. Sometimes I'd catch glimpses of a shape, almost human but wrong. No eyes, no clear face, just an outline that shifted and shimmered just beyond focus. And each time it got near a camera, the footage glitched more severely. The colors bled and blurred, the image stuttered, then froze before cutting out. It wasn't like the usual glitches either. None of the cameras acted up when the figure wasn't there. I checked all the wiring and power sources. Everything was solid. What creeped me out the most was how the snow and leaves stayed pristine. There was no evidence on the ground that anything had passed through. No broken branches, no footprints, no disturbed grass. It was as if the figure was moving through the space, but somehow not interacting with it, like a ghost or a trick of light. One evening, I took my rifle and headed out to the clearing, figuring I might get lucky and spot whatever it was. The air was crisp and still. The sky was clear, the northern lights faintly glowing over the horizon, but I didn't see any movement. I settled near the cameras, keeping low behind a fallen spruce. I waited for hours, scanning the shadows with my headlamp off, eyes adjusting to the darkness. The only sounds were the occasional crack of ice on the river and the soft rustle of wind through the trees. About midnight, something shifted in the clearing. At first, it was just a flicker, a sudden ripple of shadow near one of the cameras. Then the same smooth, elongated figure appeared, moving slowly across the snow without a sound. It didn't acknowledge me or the light from my campfire. It glided like it was part of the night itself, limbs stretching far longer than any humans could. My breath caught, but I didn't move. Then the air around me seemed to pulse. The hairs on my arms stood up. My radio, which had been silent, started crackling with static. The temperature dropped sharply, like someone opened a freezer door right next to me. The figure moved closer to the cameras, and just like before, the signal from each camera started to warp. I noticed the snow under the figure stayed undisturbed, almost like it was floating. I felt watched, not by the figure, but something else, like the whole forest was holding its breath. I kept my eyes on the shape until it slipped back into the tree line and vanished. The radio went silent. The temperature slowly climbed back to normal. When I got back to the cabin, I reviewed the footage again. The glitches were worse than ever. Frames tearing and colors bleeding into each other like paint running down a canvas. I told a few folks in town, but you know how it goes. Some nodded, some just smiled politely. No one else had seen anything like that, and most chalked it up to wildlife or camera malfunction. I kept watching the footage for weeks after. The figure never showed up anywhere else but that clearing. It moved too smoothly to be any animal I knew, and the lack of physical disturbance around it was the strangest part. Sometimes, late at night, I'd swear I heard that soft thumping rhythm, like footsteps without a sound, echoing through the cabin. I'd look outside and there'd be nothing but the vast empty Yukon wilderness, silent and waiting. I don't know what it was or what it wanted, but it was there, watching, moving just beyond the edge of what I could see or understand. And the more I looked, the less I felt like I knew my own backyard. I was about 8 hours into my shift when I first noticed something odd. Name's Eli Harper, and I've been working as a miner around the Yukon Flats for the better part of a decade now. Mostly placer mining, but this particular contract had me down in an old lode mine that's been mostly forgotten. We're talking deep in the mountain, far from any roads or radio signals. Just me, the drill, and the narrow tunnels. It was late October, early dark, and the air outside had that sharp bite that hints winter's coming hard. I'd been working alone for a couple of days, pulling core samples and mapping veins when I spotted the first flicker. I was down a side shaft, crouched near a wall I was supposed to chip away for samples. I glanced up, and through a thin crack in the rock, maybe an inch wide, there was this faint glow. Not steady, more like little pulses of light, irregular. Almost like a candle fighting a breeze, but colder, sharper. At first, I thought maybe it was some reflection from my headlamp bouncing off a patch of quartz or pyrite, but the light wasn't gold or white. It was this pale, bluish green, kind of eerie. Not something you see naturally in a mine, that's for sure. I leaned closer, trying not to disturb the rock around it. The crack was narrow, jagged, but the light flickered on and off. No pattern I could figure out. It wasn't a steady hum or a mechanical noise, just silence and the faint glow. Curiosity got the better of me. I moved my hand away from the drill and decided to follow it. The tunnel was tight, and I didn't want to cause a collapse, so I just eased forward, watching that crack in the wall. The further I got, the more cracks I noticed, all with the same irregular flickering glow. It was subtle, but definitely there. No heat from it either. In fact, that part of the tunnel felt colder than anything I'd been in before. I'm talking bone-chilling cold, like you step outside in January and the wind cuts through your jacket. That was the first thing that set me on edge. Mines usually hold some chill, sure, but this was different. The air felt heavier, and it tasted off. Not bad, just different. Almost like you could see it. I know it sounds crazy, but the air in that spot almost looked thicker, darker somehow. I tried calling out just to break the silence. Hello? Anybody there? My voice bounced back hollow. No response, just the soft crackle of the faint light flickering through the rocks. I kept following the glow. The tunnels twisted and turned, and the flickering wasn't always in the same spot. Sometimes it was closer to the ceiling, sometimes near the floor. I noticed that when I looked directly at the cracks, the light would dim or vanish, but when I looked away or from the corner of my eye, it'd pulse again. That was weird, like the light didn't want me staring at it. I shook it off at first, thinking maybe I was just tired or spooked from working alone in the dark. But then the temperature dropped even more, like someone opened a freezer door nearby. My breath started fogging in the beam of my headlamp, and I had to zip my jacket tighter. I checked my watch. No sudden weather changes outside that I knew of. The mine was deep, insulated from surface temps. I started feeling a creeping kind of dread, but not the kind you get from danger or fear. More like confusion mixed with this weird, empty feeling. The light wasn't threatening, but it felt like it didn't belong. I paused near a cluster of these cracks, and the glow vanished entirely. Not just flickered out, it was like someone switched it off. I waited, heart thumping louder, scanning every inch with my lamp. Nothing. Then, the cold really hit. The kind that sinks into your bones, colder than anything I'd felt underground before. My fingers stiffened on the drill handle. I reached for my radio and clicked the button. Static. Dead air. I tried again. Nothing. Normally, I get a signal deep here, bouncing off some relay or whatever, but this time the radio was silent. No crackles, no voices. That's when I noticed the silence around me. No dripping water, no distant echoes of rock settling, no wind pushing through cracks. Just a dead stillness. It was so quiet, it felt like the tunnel itself was holding its breath. I glanced back toward where I'd come, ready to turn around and head back, but the path looked different. The shadows shifted oddly, and the rock faces seemed smoother, almost unnatural. I shook my head. "Get a grip, Eli," I muttered. The light flickered again, but this time on a crack just a few feet ahead. I took a slow step forward, then another. The glow pulsed, irregular, dimming when I stared at it, coming back when I looked sideways. I reached out, finger nearly touching the cool stone where the crack was. That's when the air shifted. The cold deepened, and suddenly the tunnel felt smaller, tighter, like something invisible was pressing in. I backed off, breathing heavier. My headlamp caught a faint outline beyond the cracks, nothing solid, more like a shadow shifting in and out of the corner of my eye. I spun toward the main tunnel entrance, ready to get out. But the path looked different again. I swear the walls had shifted. The angles weren't the same. It was like I'd walked into a place that didn't line up with the mind map or reality. I started retracing my steps fast, but the further I went, the colder and quieter it got. The last thing I remember before finally breaking out of the tunnels was a low humming sound. Not mechanical, not animal, just a constant vibration that you feel more than hear. I pushed through the entrance and was hit by the fresh air, the cold of the evening, but this time normal, like it should be. I sat down on a rock outside the mine, heart pounding, trying to make sense of it. Back at camp, I told the foreman what happened. He just nodded and said some old mines have their quirks, maybe a pocket of cold air or unusual minerals. But I knew that wasn't it. I went back the next day with the other guy from camp to check the tunnels, but the cracks with the flickering light were gone. The walls looked solid, no gaps, no sign anything was there at all. The temperature inside was back to normal, the radio worked fine, and the silence was just regular mine silence. That was weeks ago. Since then, I've checked every day, tried to find that place again. No luck. Sometimes at night, I catch myself staring at the rocks, waiting for that faint blue-green flicker to show up. The cold part I can still feel in my bones. I don't know what I saw, or if it was even there, but I know the mine's deeper than we thought, and sometimes the earth holds onto things we don't understand. I was stationed at a fire lookout tower near Denali that summer, one of those old wooden rigs perched on a ridge where you get a clear view of miles of wilderness. My name's Jake Merrick, and I'd been doing lookout work off and on since I was a kid, family tradition mostly. The job's simple in theory. Watch the forest for fires, report any smoke or danger over the radio, then pass the long stretches of quiet with reading or napping. But that week in late July didn't follow the usual script. It started on the second night. I'd been sitting on the deck just after midnight, scanning the dark horizon with my binoculars when I noticed something odd. There were these lights, slow moving, drifting across the sky in a pattern that didn't quite make sense. They weren't airplanes or helicopters. They didn't have blinking red or green lights like any aircraft I'd seen, just steady, pale glows, sort of white, but with a faint blue tint. And they moved smoothly, almost floating rather than flying. I rubbed my eyes, thinking maybe the haze from the humidity was messing with my vision. But the lights kept appearing and disappearing in the same way, sometimes clustering, sometimes spacing out like they were patrolling a route. I tried to radio the ranger station to see if anyone else was seeing this, but the radio just crackled. No response, and no matter how many times I keyed the mic, the static stayed stubborn. The interference was strange because my radio was usually rock solid. I even tried my backup handheld, same deal, just a low, humming static that buzzed under any attempt to speak or listen. I was stuck in silence except for the hiss. That first night, I chalked it up to some weird atmospheric interference or a glitch in my radio gear. The forest gets quiet at night, but sometimes the electronics have their own quirks. I figured I'd call the station first thing in the morning and check if anyone else had radio trouble. But the next night, same thing. The lights came back, moving slow and steady across the sky. I tried to snap some photos with my phone, but the camera couldn't quite catch them. Just fuzzy blobs, nothing clear enough to show anyone. The radio was dead again. Over the following days, the pattern kept up. Lights drifting silently, radio silent except for static. It was like the tower was cut off from the world every night around midnight and stayed that way until dawn. What really got under my skin was how the dogs from the nearby cabins reacted. I could hear them barking off in the distance when the lights showed up, but it was an uneasy kind of barking. Low, growly, not the usual, "Hey, there's a stranger" bark. Almost like they sensed something unnatural in the air. I started keeping a log, noting the times the interference began and ended and the position of the lights. They always hovered low, just above the tree line, moving west to east, then disappearing as the sun began to rise. One night, about halfway through the week, I was walking along the narrow path from the tower to the helipad when I caught a glimpse of something behind the trees. I stopped dead, heart pounding. It was a shape, tall and slender, standing still but clearly watching. No sound, no movement except a slight shimmer in the air around it like a heat haze or a mirage. I called out, my voice cracking. Nothing. I flicked on my flashlight, swung it toward where I saw the figure, but the beam just hit empty space. When I looked again, it was gone. Just the quiet forest, nothing moving. I tried to shake it off as a trick of the light or a deer standing in the shadows, but it didn't feel right. I felt eyes on me for the rest of the walk back, like the forest itself was watching. The radio interference started up again just after midnight that night. I couldn't reach anyone, no matter what frequency I tried. The lights appeared, hovering and drifting in that same slow pattern. I kept my eyes on them, but after a while, I realized I wasn't hearing the usual sounds of the forest. No wind in the pines, no insects buzzing, just a deep, unsettling silence. It was as if the entire world outside the tower had gone still. I don't know how long I stood there watching, but time felt weird. My watch showed almost an hour passing in what felt like minutes. When I finally shook myself loose and looked away, the lights vanished one by one, fading into the gray sky. The next day, I checked in with the ranger station again, this time with a landline phone from the nearby cabin. They had no reports of any strange lights or radio issues. The folks there seemed to think I was just dealing with bad weather or poor radio reception. It was frustrating. I'd spent nights alone, cut off from help, staring at these unexplained lights and feeling that eerie silence press in. The whole thing felt like it was happening just for me, or at least only I was noticing. On the last night, I decided to stay up until dawn to see if anything changed. The lights came again, the radio hummed its static, and the dogs in the distance barked softly but steadily. I watched as one of the orbs slowed down, hovering almost directly above the tower. It pulsed faintly, like it was breathing. I kept my gaze fixed, my hands trembling in the cold air. The light grew dimmer and started to dissolve, but before it disappeared completely, I thought I heard a soft, almost musical hum vibrating through the air. Not loud, but enough to make my skin crawl. Then the radio snapped back on, clear and crisp, for a split second. I heard the ranger's voice calling my name. I reached for the mic, but the connection cut out as fast as it came. Silence again. Morning came, and with it the usual sounds of the forest returning. Birds calling, wind rustling. The world went back to normal, like the night's strange occurrences had been a bad dream. I packed up and left the tower the next day. Back in town, everything felt louder, busier, and less mysterious. I still think about those nights, about the lights drifting overhead, the silence that wasn't natural, the shape in the trees that disappeared before I could get a good look. I don't know what it was. No one else seems to have seen it. And maybe that's the weirdest part. But whatever it was, it left me with a feeling that some parts of the wild aren't meant to be understood. Just watched, quietly, from a distance. I was about halfway through my week-long hunting trip up in the Alaska Range when I stumbled on something that didn't sit right with me. My name's Carl Jensen. I'm a lifelong Alaskan, born and raised near Talkeetna, and I know the backcountry well enough to tell when something's off. That spring, the weather was colder than usual. Cold enough that the snow was sticking around thick, even in late April. But I found myself looking at a patch of ground that looked like it belonged in mid-July. I was following a trail I'd never taken before, tucked between two ridges. The wind was sharp that day, making the pines creak and moan. I'd been tracking moose signs, hoping to catch a glimpse or get a clean shot. I didn't see anything at first, but the deeper I went, the quieter it got. Not the good kind of quiet where it's just peaceful, more like the kind that feels like the woods are holding their breath. That's when I saw it. Right in a small clearing, there was a perfect circle maybe 15 feet across where the snow and ice had melted away completely. The ground was bare dirt, wet and dark, but the temperature was still well below freezing. I checked the air around me, cold enough that my breath hung like smoke. The rest of the forest was covered in thick snow, but this circle was clear. No footprints, no branches, just bare earth. I knelt down and touched the ground. It was oddly warm, like something underneath was giving off heat, but when I pressed my hand, it wasn't hot or burning, just warmer than it should have been for the air temp. Weird thing was, there was no sign of sunlight or anything obvious that could have melted the snow like that. I stood up and noticed the trees around the clearing. The bark on several pines was blackened, like they'd been scorched by fire, but there wasn't any ash or burnt needles on the ground. It wasn't normal burn marks either. The patterns looked deliberate, like someone had carved symbols into the trees with a blowtorch. The shapes didn't make sense to me, though. Not the kind of scratches you see from bears or axes. The marks curved and twisted in ways that looked almost like letters or writing, but not any alphabet I knew. Something unfamiliar. I felt uneasy. The forest didn't feel right anymore. I glanced behind me, half expecting to see someone watching, but there was no one. only the wind whispering through the pines and the crunch of snow under my boots. I pulled out my phone to snap some pictures, but it froze up. The screen went black and stayed that way. I tried rebooting it a few times, but no luck. Uh, I figured maybe the cold had finally done it in. I spent a few minutes circling the clearing, trying to find a logical explanation. Maybe geothermal activity? But the ground showed no signs of cracks or steam vents, and the trees just outside the circle looked untouched. No signs of a campfire or lightning strike, either. Just that scorched bark with strange patterns and a circle of bare earth that shouldn't have been there. I shrugged and started heading back to camp, telling myself it was probably some odd natural phenomenon I didn't understand. Maybe a pocket of warm air trapped under the snow or something. But then the feeling hit again, that sense of being watched. I stopped and scanned the trees. The shadows seemed to stretch longer than they should have in the fading daylight. I caught movement out of the corner of my eye, just a flicker of a dark shape between two trees. When I looked directly, it was gone. I didn't hear any animal calls or movement, just silence and a quiet hum in the air, low and barely audible, like distant electricity crackling but without a source. My skin prickled. I tried to focus on breathing steady, but it felt like the air was thickening around me. I told myself to get a grip, but I kept glancing back toward the clearing. As I neared my camp that evening, the sky was clear, but the stars looked odd, like they were twinkling out of sync or flickering in a weird rhythm. I'd spent enough nights under Alaska's open sky to know when something seemed off. I didn't sleep much that night. Next morning, I decided to check the clearing again, thinking maybe the previous day's sun had changed something. When I got back, the circle was still there. Snow hadn't crept in at all, which was weird given the overnight temperatures had dropped again. The scorch marks on the trees looked sharper in daylight, but still no sign of damage to the needles or ground litter. I ran my fingers over the bark, feeling the roughness of the charred patches. The patterns were definitely deliberate, like they were etched with some kind of tool, but the shapes kept twisting as if they weren't meant to be read the way we read letters. I tried whistling to break the silence, but the sound echoed oddly, like the forest wasn't carrying it away but holding it close. That's when I noticed the snow line on the ridge opposite the clearing. It looked like it curved away in a perfect arc, as if the clearing's circle had a shadow larger than itself. Then I saw footprints in the snow leading away from the clearing, but they weren't animal tracks. They looked human, but odd. The prints were too big, and the toes weren't clearly defined, more like vague impressions, like they'd been made by someone wearing boots with no tread, or maybe something softer. I followed them cautiously for a few yards, but they faded into the snow without any explanation. That day, I didn't tell anyone about what I found. I kept to myself and stayed on the trail, trying to ignore the nagging feeling in the back of my head. The last night, before heading back, I heard noises just beyond my tent. Quiet scratching, like something was rubbing against the canvas. I peeked outside, but all I could see was the black silhouette of the forest. No eyes reflected back. No shape moved in the moonlight. I decided not to sleep there. I packed up and started hiking down the next morning. When I reached my truck, the radio was static-free again, and the world felt like it had pressed the reset button. I still think about that spot in the woods. The perfect circle where snow and ice had no business melting, the scorched trees with those strange marks, and the footprints that didn't quite belong. I haven't gone back since. Maybe I will someday, but part of me hopes I don't find it again. Because whatever made that clearing wasn't just some random heat pocket or forest fire, and it sure as hell wasn't something I could explain. I'm Jonah Marks, and I work up at the Nenana Observatory. Not a big place, but it's our spot for scanning the skies and tracking whatever the weather and the auroras let us see. It's pretty remote, tucked in just past the edge of the Tanana Valley, and you get used to long stretches of silence and darkness, especially in the winter. Most folks up here are used to the quiet, but sometimes that quiet gets weird. It was late February, well into the long night season, when the sun barely peaks above the horizon. The cold had settled in for real, and the wind was rattling the observatory's windows like it was trying to tell me something. I was doing a late shift, alone, except for the blinking lights of the equipment and the endless hum of the heaters. I was monitoring the radio telescope, which usually picks up natural cosmic noise like pulsars or solar flares. Nothing fancy, mostly background static with occasional bursts. But that night, something caught my attention. A faint signal, just barely there at first, repeating on a loop. It didn't sound like anything I'd seen before. No pattern matching any known star or pulsar frequency. It was almost rhythmic, but not quite, like it was trying to imitate something but missing the beat. I double-checked the system logs and cross-checked it with nearby observatories via satellite link, but nobody else reported it. The weirdest part was the signal's apparent location. When I checked the antenna's pointing coordinates, the source was moving slowly along the horizon, hovering just above the tree line outside. It didn't match any known satellites or planes, none of the usual traffic tracked on radar or by the FAA's system. At first, I thought it was some glitch, equipment acting up or interference from the weather, but the weather was stable that night. Clear skies, no clouds or storms for miles. The signal kept coming back every few minutes, always the same faint pulse. I started jotting down times and coordinates, watching the source drift a little north, then dip back south, never rising higher than maybe 10 degrees above the horizon. Around 3 a.m., I noticed something else out the window. There was this glow, faint and pulsing, coming from the edge of the forest beyond the observatory. It wasn't like the aurora, which usually fills the whole sky in rolling curtains of green and pink. This was small, contained, a soft amber light that flickered behind the spruce. I grabbed my coat and headed out, boots crunching on the frozen ground. The air was sharper than inside, biting at my cheeks, but the sky was crystal clear. The light wasn't moving, just flickering steadily like a lantern or campfire. I walked closer, careful not to make noise. The snow was untouched, except for my prints, and no animals stirred. When I got within 50 yards, the light vanished, like someone snuffed out a candle. That's when I saw it. A series of impressions pressed into the snow. Tracks, but unlike any animal I'd seen. They were broad, maybe 8 inches across, and spaced evenly, almost like large, flat pads pressed into the ground. The pattern didn't curve or zigzag like a bear or wolf. It moved in a straight line toward the tree line, then just stopped. I stood there for a long minute, trying to hear something. Nothing. The silence was heavy, like the forest was holding its breath. I went back inside, shook off the cold, and sat back down at the controls. The signal was still there, pulsing quietly. Over the next few nights, the pattern repeated. The signal returned on the same schedule, drifting just above the horizon, and every time the light appeared near the tree line, always flickering for a few minutes, then gone. The tracks showed up after each sighting, always fresh, always the same broad shape, always stopping just inside the forest. I started keeping a log, noting the signal's timings and the light's appearances. Sometimes the signal drifted a bit faster, sometimes it paused, but it never disappeared completely. The movements were too irregular for any man-made object I knew, too purposeful to be random natural interference. The locals heard about the flickering light by the third night. They shrugged it off as a hunter's fire or an electrical glitch. There's always stories like this around here, but I could tell a few of the older folks were uneasy. One night, around 5 a.m., I was watching the signal when something different happened. The source stopped moving and held steady right on the horizon. The pulse grew stronger, brighter somehow. I looked outside again, and the light was back. This time, larger and steady, glowing with a pale blue tint. I felt a kind of pressure in the air, like when a storm's about to break but without any wind or clouds. My skin prickled, and the hairs on my arms stood up. I wasn't afraid exactly, just aware, like I'd walked into a conversation I wasn't meant to hear. Then the light blinked out. I checked outside, no tracks this time. The snow was pristine, no sign that anything had been near. I spent the next morning combing through the forest edge where the tracks usually appeared, but there was nothing. No disturbed branches, no broken twigs, no footprints besides my own from the night before. The signal persisted for a few more nights, but after that blue light, it started to weaken. Eventually, it disappeared altogether. I still check the sky and the radio feed when I'm up there. Sometimes, when the wind is just right, I swear I hear a faint tapping on the observatory's roof or see shadows flitting past the windows, but there's never anything there when I look. I don't know what I was tracking or what the light was out there. Could have been some rare atmospheric phenomenon or maybe a bird with bioluminescence I've never heard of. But it all felt different, like something just outside our understanding, quietly watching, leaving hints, but never revealing more. So that's it. Just some nights up in the cold, staring at a signal that shouldn't be there, and a light that doesn't belong. I guess some things in the sky don't want to be found. My name's Eli Turner. I'm from a little village up near the Brooks Range. Nothing more than a few cabins huddled by the river where the snow sticks around most of the year and the daylight is just a whisper during winter. I don't get out much, but I know the folks around here, especially the old-timers who've been around since before I was born. They like to share stories over a fire when the wind's howling outside. Wake. And one of their favorites is about something they call the silent visitor. I never paid it much mind at first, just another piece of local color, like the stories about spirits or the moose that wander into town. But that winter, something happened that made me see those tales in a different light. It started in early December when the river froze solid enough for us to walk on. Old man Keita, the eldest in the village, told me about the visitor that comes every year when the nights are long and the cold gets sharp. He said this visitor never speaks, never makes a sound, but always leaves strange carvings on the ice, symbols nobody could make heads or tails of. One morning, I woke up early and headed down to the river, hoping to see these carvings for myself. The village was still wrapped in that thick quiet that only comes with deep winter. The only sound was the crunch of my boots on the snow-packed trail. When I got to the riverbank, I saw it. There were the carvings. They looked like a series of interlocking shapes, kind of like runes or some old script, but nothing I recognized. They were cut deep into the thick ice, the edges sharp and clean, as if made with a blade. The patterns ran maybe 20 feet across, and I could see frost creeping into the lines, making them glow faintly in the pale morning light. I crouched down and traced a finger near one of the symbols. The ice was cold as hell, of course, but what threw me was how the shapes seemed off, like they weren't quite stable. I don't know how to explain it exactly, but if you looked away for a second and then back, they'd seem to shift ever so slightly. I blinked a few times, but the shapes just weren't lining up the way they had a moment before. I stood back and stared longer, trying to convince myself I was just tired or my eyes were playing tricks. But that wasn't the end of it. That night, I couldn't sleep, so I grabbed my coat and flashlight and headed back to the river. The moon was low and casting weak light over the snow. The air was sharp, and the whole world felt frozen solid. When I reached the spot, the symbols were still there, but they had changed. Some of the lines were longer, others shorter. The pattern seemed rearranged, like a puzzle with pieces sliding around in the dark. I checked my phone for the time and noticed nearly 2 hours had passed since I first saw them that morning. I tried calling the village, no signal. The cold had knocked out the tower's line, or so I figured. I circled the carvings a few times, careful not to disturb the ice. The feeling I got standing there was strange. Not fear, exactly. More like being watched, but by something waiting quietly, keeping close. I stayed out a little longer, then walked back toward the village. That's when I caught sight of footprints in the snow leading off toward the tree line. They were fresh, maybe just hours old, but they weren't like anything I'd seen before. The prints were wide, with no clear toes or claw marks, just ovals spaced evenly apart. Curious and a little uneasy, I followed them cautiously. They disappeared into the shadow of the spruce and birch, where the snow was untouched beneath the canopy. The next day, I showed the carvings to Keita and a few others. They listened but said nothing new, just nodded slowly like they'd seen it all before. Keita said the visitor never comes closer than the river's edge, always silent, always watching. Over the next week, I kept checking the ice. The symbols kept shifting every time I looked. Sometimes they'd form patterns that looked almost like words, other times like maps or charts. The more I stared, the less I could make sense of them. They seemed to breathe, almost alive. One night, when the northern lights were flickering faintly overhead, I heard something moving near the tree line while I was out walking. It wasn't an animal, no growls or calls, just soft footsteps crunching on dry branches. I turned and shined my flashlight toward the sound, but there was nothing there. The light caught on something metallic just beyond the trees, a dull, curved shape half buried in snow. I went over and brushed the snow away, but I couldn't figure out what it was. It didn't look like anything from around here, at least not any tool or gear I recognized. It was smooth, almost polished, but worn and scratched like it had been there a long time. I stuffed it in my pack and headed back, heart pounding. When I got home, I tried cleaning it up more, but it stayed cold and strangely heavy, like it didn't belong. By then, the village started talking more about the silent visitor. Some people said they'd seen flickers of light moving across the river at night, tiny glows that vanished if you blinked. Others heard soft tapping noises on the roof or saw shadows that didn't match any trees. I don't know if it was connected to those carvings or the shape I found. Maybe it was just winter madness setting in with the long nights and endless cold. But the strangest part came a few days later. I woke up and grabbed my jacket, planning to check the ice again. When I got there, the carvings were gone. The river was smooth and perfect, like the cold had erased every trace. I looked around, but there was no sign the visitor had been back. The footprints in the snow were faded, trampled by wind and animals. I walked home slow, feeling like something I'd seen was slipping away with the thaw. I still keep that piece of metal in my cabin. It sits on the windowsill, catching the weak sunlight in the morning. It doesn't rust or change, but sometimes when the light hits it just right, it throws little shadows on the wall, shadows that don't look quite right. I don't know what I saw or what that visitor really is. Nobody does. But some winters, when the nights drag on and the river freezes hard, I swear I can still hear soft scraping sounds on the ice, like a silent hand carving out its stories. My name's Eli Turner. I'm a field researcher, mostly studying permafrost and lake ice in the interior of Alaska. That last trip back in early March was one of those where the place starts feeling less like home and more like some kind of halfway point between here and nowhere. We set up camp on this frozen lake just outside the Alaska Range near the little town of Cantwell. It's a spot my team's been eyeing for a while. Thick ice, steady cold, and some promising ground samples below. The kind of place you don't go if you're looking for company, which suited me fine. The first few days went smooth enough. We drilled cores, took measurements, and mapped the ice thickness. The lake's surface was vast and mirror flat, dusted with fresh snow that never stuck long because of the wind. We pitched our tents in a rough circle near the southern shore, close enough to the trees to cut some firewood, but far enough away to keep the camp quiet and safe. On the second night, I noticed something odd with my compass. I was double-checking bearings, trying to confirm our position relative to the ridge east of us. I pointed the compass toward the ridge like usual, but the needle spun wildly. Not a slow drift, but a frantic, twitchy dance. I figured it was a glitch or some interference, so I swapped it for another one. Same thing. The guys in the other tents heard me muttering, came out to check, and sure enough, their compasses were spinning too. We looked at each other like, what the hell? The ridge was just some granite outcropping. Nothing metal, no radio towers or anything that should be messing with magnets. We tried different spots around camp, and the spin only happened when pointing at the ridge. Point anywhere else, and the needles behaved normally. That alone was strange enough. But that night, when we came back from dinner, one of the crew called me out. Eli, look at this. We stepped into the moonlight, which was pale but steady thanks to the clear sky and snow reflection. Around our tents were footprints, large, bare impressions pressed into the snow. No boot treads, no snowshoes, nothing like anything we'd left. The prints were spaced evenly, forming a perfect circle roughly 30 feet wide around the camp. What threw us was that the prints didn't lead anywhere. They just looped around, crossing paths but never continuing beyond the circle. No breaks, no signs of exit or approach, like something had walked in circles all night, keeping its distance but watching. I checked the prints closer. They looked wrong, too symmetrical, too neat for any animal I knew. They weren't the right shape for a moose or wolf, and the spacing was too consistent for anything natural. The snow between and beyond the circle was untouched. The others joked at first. Frozen lake ghost footprints, or some prank from the snowshoe rats in town. But no one laughed too hard. The mood shifted. Everyone was a little on edge. I spent the rest of that night near the edge of camp, watching the ridge where the compass went haywire. The wind hummed through the trees, and the snow made everything sharp and quiet. The stars above looked familiar but distant, like they'd been rearranged just enough to make me pause. I swear I saw movement at the tree line. Something slipping between the trunks, maybe 2 or 3 shapes, but the shadows were too fast and too still all at once, like they weren't quite part of the forest. The next day we tried to ignore it, but the strange compass behavior continued. Every time I pointed it east toward the ridge, the needle spun like it had a mind of its own. That afternoon, while hiking to check sample sites closer to the ridge, I caught that movement again. Not animals. This was too deliberate. The shapes seemed to stay just at the edge of visibility, disappearing whenever I slowed down or tried to focus. That night, back at camp, the footprints were there again, still perfectly circular, fresh as before, but no new prints beyond the ring. I asked around about local stories when we radioed Cantwell for supplies. Old-timers talked about odd things seen on the ridge, strange lights, weird sounds on windless nights, and people who got lost only to show up hours later with no memory of where they'd been. I didn't pay much mind to the tales, but the feeling stayed with me. Something was out there watching us, maybe even moving closer, but always careful to stay just out of reach. By the 4th day, the compasses began spinning when pointed at the ridge, even from our snowmobiles and handheld units. Other electronics started acting up too. Radios crackled with static, GPS units would freeze or glitch. The ridge seemed to be messing with all of it, like a magnetic storm trapped in stone. One evening, while we sat around the small propane heater inside the main tent, the lights flickered. For a second, everything went dark except for the glow outside. I looked out and saw the ridge bathed in a pale, shifting light. It wasn't the moon or northern lights. It was soft, almost liquid in quality, pulsing slowly like a breath. No one else saw it. They were busy fixing gear and didn't notice my stare. I wanted to call it a trick of the eyes, but it felt real, alive somehow. The hairs on my neck stood up. I went outside for a closer look, leaving the others behind. The snow was still and deep, the air colder than before. The light on the ridge faded as I watched, but then I noticed something new. Small glimmers between the trees, like reflections off something smooth and wet, moving just beyond where I could see clearly. I thought I caught a glimpse of shapes, tall, thin, but not like any animal I knew. They didn't move like creatures with legs, but more like shadows sliding along the ground. I turned to head back, but for a moment I couldn't find my footprints in the snow. The path I just walked looked untouched, as if I'd appeared there without crossing the snow at all. The feeling of being watched deepened. I hurried back to camp, checking behind me every few steps, but no sounds or shapes followed. That night, the footprints circled the camp again. This time, they were joined by faint, shallow grooves cutting across the snow inside the ring. Almost like something dragged itself quietly from point to point, but the marks were too light to be anything solid. I didn't sleep much. The weight of those prints pressed on me like a question with no answer. By the 5th day, the compasses and electronics were useless. We packed up and headed back to Cantwell, leaving the lake and the ridge behind. Driving away, I kept glancing at the horizon, half expecting to see those flickering shapes watching us go. Back in town, the weirdness didn't follow. The compasses spun straight again, and the snow showed no sign of any strange tracks, but the memory of that place stayed. Sometimes when the wind is still and the sky is clear, I find myself looking east toward that ridge, wondering what exactly was out there in the silence. Whatever it was, it didn't come close enough to speak or show itself clearly. It just circled us, silent and patient, leaving its marks in the snow and messing with our instruments. I don't have answers, just the sense that some part of Alaska's wild still holds secrets not meant for easy understanding. I guess that's part of why we keep going back, chasing what's out there, even if it never quite lets us find it. I was halfway through a solo hunt up near the Arctic Ocean, somewhere west of Kotzebue. I'd been out there for a couple days, camping on the tundra near the coast, mostly hunting for ptarmigan and maybe a fox or two. The weather was brutal cold, sure, but I dealt with worse. I set up my tent on a small rise out of the way of any obvious drift paths and made a fire pit a little ways off. I didn't expect company, not this far out, so I kept things simple. That first night was as quiet as you'd expect. Just the occasional howl of wind brushing over the snow, the odd caw from some distant raven. I had my headlamp on low, reading some notes in my journal, tracking where I'd spotted a few game trails. I'd been feeling a little on edge, but nothing unusual for that kind of solitude. The next morning, I packed up my gear, checked the snow for any signs of other people or animals, just the usual tracks from a fox or maybe a hare. I figured I'd move camp closer to the shore, where the wind usually eased up a bit. I didn't see anything out of place. I set up again that afternoon, closer to the coastline, just a few hundred yards from where the ice meets the ocean. The sky was heavy with clouds, low and thick, the kind that muffled sound. I didn't mind. It made the place feel even more isolated, but peaceful in its own way. That night, I woke up cold. Wind must have shifted and found its way into the tent zipper somehow. I looked out the little window and caught a faint glow just beyond the fire pit. Not quite right for the area. I thought maybe it was a reflection from ice or some strange moonlight filtered through clouds, but the glow didn't flicker or move. It just hung there, low and steady. I stayed still, watching, thinking maybe I was seeing things or the dark was playing tricks on me. I've been out here long enough to know when my brain's fooling me, but I couldn't shake the feeling something was off. I finally drifted back to sleep though, despite it. The next morning is when I noticed it, the stones. I stepped outside, expecting to see the usual snow and scattered rocks that get exposed when the wind blows hard. Instead, right there around the tent, laid out on the snow, was a spiral pattern made up of dozens of smooth, perfectly round stones. Each one was about the size of a small apple, all the same shape, like someone had hand-picked them and arranged them there carefully. I froze. I knew I hadn't put those there. I'd been up all night in the tent, and when I'd gone to bed, the area around the tent had been clean. The snow showed no footprints or tracks leading to or away from the stones. It was as if they just appeared out of thin air. I knelt down and ran my hand over one. It was cold and hard, of course, but also unnervingly smooth. The stones didn't have any marks or scratches, no signs of weathering or erosion like the ones I'd found scattered around before. These looked fresh, like someone had polished them just yesterday. I walked the spiral's edge slowly, looking for anything. Tracks, animal prints, disturbed snow. Nothing. The wind was light, so if someone had come through, I'd have seen some sign by now. I thought about calling someone, but there was no cell signal out here. The satellite phone was back at base camp. I wasn't about to leave camp in this weather, and besides, the thought of walking out with those stones circling the tent made me uneasy. All morning, I kept scanning the horizon, half expecting to see someone lurking just out of sight. But there was nothing. No figures on the skyline, no movement beyond the usual drifting clouds and occasional seabirds wheeling overhead. The stones stayed there all day. I didn't touch them again except to inspect a few more. When the wind picked up, snow drifted over some edges, but the pattern held. I tried moving a couple stones just to see if I could figure out how heavy they were, but it was like they'd been carefully placed to stay in position. After that, I left them be. That night, I double-checked my tent flaps, made sure everything was zipped tight. The glow came back, faint at first, just beyond the fire pit. This time I could see it was a soft, pale light, almost like it was coming from the stones themselves, but I couldn't be sure. I figured I was just tired, imagining things again. I was cold and restless. Around midnight, I heard something, a soft crunch in the snow, not far from the tent. I held my breath and listened, but the sound stopped. Nothing followed. No other noise, no footsteps. I pulled the sleeping bag up tighter, trying to ignore it. In that kind of cold, every little sound echoes and seems to come from everywhere at once. Morning came slow, and I was grateful. The stones were still there, unchanged. I packed up camp carefully, making sure not to disturb the pattern as I stepped out. The stones didn't seem to shift or change, no matter what I did. On my way back to the main trail, I looked back once, and the spiral was still intact, a strange contrast against the endless white. I never saw anyone or anything else out there, no footprints, no voices, nothing. The whole thing felt like some quiet, deliberate message, but I never figured out who left it or why. Back in town, I showed the photos to a few folks, but all I got were shrugs and jokes about Arctic spirits or just the wind playing tricks. Maybe that's all it was. But even now, thinking about those smooth stones arranged in that perfect spiral with no tracks or explanation, it's the kind of thing that makes you wonder if there's more out there than what we usually see. I still go back to the Arctic sometimes, but I never camped out that close to the ocean again. Too many questions and not enough answers. I'm Jake Lawson. I've been flying helicopters in Alaska for a little over 10 years now, mostly supply runs, medevacs, and the occasional sightseeing tour when the season's right. I've flown over glaciers, mountains, and all kinds of terrain, but there's this one trip a couple years back that still sits heavy in my mind, mostly because I can't quite explain what happened. It was late September, just past the peak of tourist season. The days were already getting short, but there was still enough light to keep things interesting. I was flying out to the Tangle Glacier, a remote spot northeast of Talkeetna, to drop off supplies for a small research team studying ice melt and glacial shifts. It's not an easy place to get to. The glacier's tucked in behind some steep ridges, and the weather can turn on you faster than you can blink. That day was calm, though. The sky was mostly clear, just a little haze along the horizon. The wind was steady but not too strong, perfect for flying. I had the usual gear, my headset, GPS, altimeter, the works. The research folks had called in the day before, said they were running low on fuel and food, so I loaded up the chopper and headed out early afternoon. As I approached the glacier, I noticed something strange. About 2 or 3 miles ahead, hanging just above the ridgeline, was a cluster of lights. They were arranged in a perfect triangle, 3 points equidistant from each other. The lights themselves weren't blinding or colored like runway markers. They were a soft white, almost like old-fashioned street lamps, but floating. They didn't flicker or pulse, just held steady. I'd seen all kinds of lights before, campfires, distant cabins, emergency flares, but nothing in a formation this precise, hovering in midair with no visible support. I glanced down at the GPS and the altimeter. No signal interference, everything normal. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that these lights weren't natural. Curious, I slowed the chopper and moved closer, banking gently to get a better look. As I did, the lights stayed perfectly still, almost like they were waiting. The silence around me was thick, the usual buzz of the engine and rotor blades feeling oddly distant, like they were muffled or underwater. I called in over the radio, checked in with Talkeetna Tower just to keep them in the loop, but no one else reported anything unusual. No other aircraft in the area. Then, as I started edging closer, maybe a little too close, the lights vanished, just like that. One moment they were there, 3 glowing points suspended against the deepening blue sky, and the next, gone. I remember feeling a jolt. The altimeter, which had been steady at about 2,200 feet, suddenly dropped sharply, almost 200 feet in a second, then bounced right back. The chopper didn't lurch or shift in any way that I could feel. Controls were steady, engine sounds normal, but the instruments didn't lie. I glanced around, scanning the sky, but there was nothing. No trail, no sound, no flicker anywhere. It felt like the air itself had shifted, or maybe the gravity. But there was no turbulence, no wind change, no visual clue to explain the dip. After that, I decided to keep my distance and headed straight for the glacier's landing zone. The research team was waiting oblivious to what I'd just seen, and we loaded up their supplies without incident. The landing zone was a rough patch of packed ice and snow, but steady enough for the chopper. While I was there, the team mentioned something about their instruments acting up recently. Magnetic compasses spinning randomly, radios cutting out briefly. They said it started around the same time a few strange lights were reported over the glacier, by some of the campers earlier that week. I didn't press them. I was more focused on keeping the weather in check and planning my return flight. The trip back was quiet. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows over the peaks, and I kept an eye out for anything unusual. But nothing showed up. No lights, no glitches. When I got back to Talkeetna, I ran a full diagnostic on the chopper. No mechanical issues, everything checked out fine. But the weirdest part? That sudden dip in altitude. It's logged in the flight data, and there's no real explanation. The conditions were stable, no air pockets, no turbulence, just that brief, unexplained drop. I've flown enough over Alaska to know when something's off, and that was definitely one of those times. I tell folks about it, but most just shrug it off as a weather glitch or instrument hiccup. Maybe it was. I'm not so sure. Sometimes when the night is quiet and the northern lights flicker overhead, I find myself staring east, thinking about those three lights hovering out by the ridge and wondering what I actually saw, or what it saw of me. Maybe someday I'll get a better look, but for now, it's just a question that stays with me out here, where the sky feels endless and the silence is heavier than it ought to be. I was working as a park ranger out by Denali during one of those long, quiet winters when the nights stretch on and on. The station was small, just me and a few radios for company, mostly dead air most nights. The kind of place where your footsteps sound loud against the snow, and you're always listening for something, anything that's not the usual silence. It started the second night I was out there alone. I was walking from the cabin to check one of the weather stations maybe 100 yards away. It was just past midnight, and the sky was clear, the stars bright and steady. As soon as I stepped outside, I noticed it, a low hum, faint but unmistakable. Like the kind of buzz you hear near power lines back home, but nothing was running near the cabin. No generators, no vehicles, just me in the forest. I stopped and listened. The hum stayed steady, soft but definitely there. It wasn't like a machine, it felt organic in a way. The kind of noise you don't expect out in the middle of nowhere, especially not when everything else is dead quiet. Curious, I started walking toward the tree line, just a few dozen feet from the cabin. The hum got louder the closer I got to the edge of the forest, like it was coming from just beyond the pines. I could feel it in my chest, a vibration that wasn't there when I was inside the cabin. I looked around, half expecting to see a piece of equipment or maybe some animals making the sound, but the snow-covered trees just stood still, heavy with frost. No signs of any machines or vehicles. Nothing. I stepped back toward the cabin, and as soon as I crossed the threshold, the hum stopped. Like someone hit a switch. I opened the door again to double check, and sure enough, it was gone inside. I figured maybe it was the wind hitting the trees in a way that made a low-frequency noise, but the wind wasn't blowing. That night I kept thinking about it, but didn't say much. Could have been fatigue, I guess. The next evening, same thing. The moment I stepped outside, there was the hum again, steady, low, vibrating through the air. I even tried recording it on my phone, but the mic barely picked anything up. Just static and a faint buzz. I started timing it. The hum seemed to start exactly when the temperature dropped below freezing, around 20 degrees or so. If it got warmer or I went inside, it disappeared. One night I decided to walk farther into the woods, following the sound. It felt like it was pulling me deeper, and the quiet around me felt thicker, heavier. I got maybe 50 yards past the tree line, where the snow was untouched and deep. The hum was almost loud enough to hear inside my helmet. Then something else happened. My radio, which I always keep on, started acting weird. The static shifted, like there was a voice buried in it, but nothing clear. I tuned the dial back and forth, and the hum seemed to sync up with the crackling, almost like they were connected. I didn't feel right being out there anymore. The cold felt sharper, like the air itself was heavier. I turned back toward the cabin, and as I got closer, the hum faded. When I stepped inside and closed the door, it was gone. The next day, I checked the weather stations for anything unusual. No storms, no electrical disturbances, nothing out of the ordinary. Satellite imagery showed no fires, no activity near the outpost. The forest looked exactly the same as always. Over the next week, the hum stuck around. I tried ignoring it, but it was always there at night, waiting just outside. I noticed something else, too. Sometimes when I looked out the window, I thought I caught movement just beyond the trees. Nothing I could catch a clear look at, just shadows shifting where there shouldn't be any. Once or twice, I caught a faint flicker of light, too, like a reflection or a glow just behind the branches. It wasn't like a flashlight or campfire. It was soft and pulsing, matching the rhythm of the hum. I told my supervisor over the radio, and he joked it was probably just me going stir-crazy up there. Maybe he was right, but I don't think I was imagining all of it. The hum was too consistent, too precise. One night, I stayed outside longer, hoping to catch whatever was making the noise. I walked around the clearing, shining my flashlight into the tree line. The snow sparkled under the beam, but nothing moved. The hum got louder, almost overwhelming, and I swear the trees themselves seemed to lean in closer, like the forest was alive and listening. I started to feel like I was being watched, not by animals, but something else. The kind of feeling you get when you're all alone in a place where you shouldn't be. After a while, I went back to the cabin, locked the door tight, and sat by the heater. Outside, the hum faded away, leaving only the normal Alaska night silence. I packed up a few days later. No signs left behind, no footprints or marks in the snow near the cabin or the weather stations. The hum was gone once I drove away. I still think about those nights sometimes. About the hum that followed me, the pulsing light behind the trees, and the feeling that the woods were watching me back. Whatever it wasn't something I could name or explain. Just a sound on the edge of hearing, a shadow on the edge of sight. It was quiet up there in Denali. Too quiet sometimes. Name's Jake Mallory. I've been running snowmobiles across the tundra around Bethel for a good chunk of my life, hauling gear, checking traps, that sort of thing. Nothing fancy, just the usual work that keeps folks going through those long winters. I'm not one for stories or tall tale tales, but what happened last January still sits with me, and I've been trying to make sense of it ever since. It was a clear night, bone cold, probably 20 below. The kind where the stars burn sharp and the air snaps in your lungs like glass. I was coming back from a run near the Kuskokwim River, cutting across the flat tundra to shave off some time. The snow was hard-packed from the freeze, perfect for riding fast, and I was making good time under the glow of the moon. I'd been watching the sky a bit that night, more out of habit than anything. Up there, past the usual constellations, the stars looked endless. That's when I noticed something strange on the horizon. A cluster of lights, bright but not like any plane or helicopter I'd ever seen. They were blinking in a way that seemed deliberate, almost mechanical, and arranged in a precise shape, like a perfect triangle, but with smaller points inside, almost like a grid. I'm not good with geometry, but it was too perfect to be random. I slowed down to get a better look, heart thumping. The lights didn't move or make a sound, just hovered silently, steady as a rock against the cold night sky. The snowmobile's engine was the only noise, and even that felt distant, like the world had muffled everything else around me. I pulled my phone out, figuring I'd try to get a photo, not that I expected much in the dark with my old camera. As I aimed, the lights vanished in an instant. Just like that. No fade, no blink off, nothing. Gone. The sky was empty, just stars again. I sat there on the sled, blinking. No lights, no noise, nothing but the cold biting at my face and the wind whispering over the snow. Then I caught it, a faint smell, something sharp and electric, like ozone mixed with burnt wood or scorched earth. I looked around, but the ground was frozen solid, no scorch marks, no smoke, just the usual tundra. I didn't know what to make of it. The smell hung in the air for a moment, then faded with the wind. I started the snowmobile again and headed back slow, looking over my shoulder every now and then, half expecting to see those lights come back. They didn't. The next few days, I kept thinking about what I'd seen. When I told a couple of friends at the general store in Bethel, they laughed it off. Probably some military drills, one said. Another guessed it was just satellites or airplanes. Maybe. But none of that explained the smell or how fast the lights disappeared. No commercial planes fly slow and silent like that, especially not in that pattern. On my way out for another run a few nights later, I took a different route to check for any signs on the ground near where the lights had been. Snow was untouched, no tracks or burns. The only thing different was the way the air felt, thicker, heavier, like the cold had weight to it. I kept looking for any flicker or glow, but the sky was just normal stars and moonlight. That night, as I headed home, I noticed the radio on my sled was acting up, static popping in and out, cutting through my favorite station. At one point, I swear I heard a faint pulse, almost like a Morse code, but it didn't make any sense. I figured maybe the cold was messing with the electronics. After that, things got stranger. On a couple of rides, I'd get this feeling like I was being watched, not by people or animals, but something else. When I stopped to check the engine or tie down gear, I'd glance around, but nothing was there. Just the endless white tundra and the frozen horizon. One night, I caught a flicker of movement out there, just beyond the tree line where the river bends, a glint of light that wasn't fire or flashlight. It was like something reflecting the moon but moving too smoothly, almost floating. I tightened my jacket and kept going, heart in my throat. After that, I started carrying a little extra gear, a flare gun, a handheld GPS, even a small digital recorder, just in case. Nothing showed up on the recorder, though. No voices, no strange sounds, just my own breathing and the snowmobile's hum. Weeks passed with no new sightings. The weather turned warmer, snow softened, and the tundra started to thaw. The weird smells and the humming vanished. Life went back to normal, or as normal as it gets out there. Still, sometimes when I'm alone out on the snow, especially on a quiet, clear night, I swear I see a flicker of blinking lights on the horizon. Never the same pattern twice, just a glimpse before they vanish. And sometimes that smell comes back on the wind, faint and electric. I don't know what it was or if anyone else will ever see it. But out there, under the endless Alaskan sky, some things don't quite fit the rules. And sometimes you catch a glimpse of them just before they disappear. The first time I heard it, I was about 3 clicks out from camp, trudging through the last stretch of tundra before the ridge where the caribou had been spotted. The morning was cool but clear, that weird kind of quiet you only get in the Alaskan wilderness, the kind where even the wind feels hushed. I was using those new boots from town, still stiff and clunky, boots I figured would hold up better on the rocky ground. Then came the tapping. It wasn't the usual woodpecker or ice falling off the cliff kind of noise. This was different, like metal on stone, regular and slow, but distant. I stopped dead, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. It echoed off the rocks in a way that made it feel close. But when I scanned the ridge, all I saw were the usual gray rocks and patches of lichen. I'm Elise Quinn, by the way, a wildlife biologist, mostly caribou, based out of Fairbanks. I've been on this job for a couple years now, doing the usual tracking, tagging, and noting migration patterns. Out here, it's mostly me and the caribou, with a couple of birds and the occasional moose. The tapping wasn't anything I'd ever heard while out on the tundra, and that's saying something. You get used to the sounds, the wind, the birds, the crunch of snow or gravel underfoot. This felt out of place, like it didn't belong. Curiosity got the better of me. I started up the ridge toward where I thought the tapping was coming from, careful not to slip on the loose gravel. The sound came in bursts, sometimes 5 or 6 taps, then a pause, then tapping again, almost like someone trying to send a message. It was faint, but distinct. As I climbed higher, the air grew colder and thinner. The tundra gave way to more jagged rock formations. Gray, almost smooth, like granite that had been weathered by centuries of wind and ice. I kept moving, but when I got to the spot where the sound should have been loudest, there was nothing. No tapping, no echo, just that usual wilderness silence. Then I noticed the hole. It was right there in the side of a big boulder, about a foot wide, perfectly round. The edges were sharp, no cracks or chips. At first I thought maybe it was a geological formation, some kind of vent or erosion, but it didn't make sense. It looked like something had been burned through the rock, but weirdly, there were no scorch marks or soot around it. The rock around the hole was as clean and gray as the rest of the boulder. I knelt down to look closer. The hole was dark inside, but I could see the far side, maybe 3 or 4 feet through. There was no smell of smoke or anything chemical, just the crisp scent of the mountain air. I reached out a gloved hand to touch the edges, half expecting it to be warm, but it was cold and solid. I stood up and looked around. No sign of a tool or equipment, no scratch marks or footprints, just the hole and the rocks. I pulled out my phone to take some pictures, but the screen flickered like it was glitching. I turned the phone off and on again, thinking it was just low battery or a bad signal. But even with a fresh restart, the camera wouldn't open. Other apps worked fine. I could check messages, maps, all that, but the camera just froze on a black screen. That's when I got the sense I wasn't alone. The tapping started again, softer this time, coming from somewhere beyond the ridge, maybe down in the valley. I couldn't tell if it was the same pattern or random. My heart picked up a bit, but I tried to keep calm. It wasn't like there were people wandering these parts at this time of year. I waited for a while, trying to catch any movement, any sign of what could be making the noise. The sun was climbing higher, making the rocks glint. I sat down on a flat stone and pulled out my notebook, jotting down what I'd seen. The hole, the sound, the phone acting weird. Later, as I was packing up to head back, I noticed something odd on the ground. The snow, which had been patchy but mostly melted around the rocks, was flattened in a circle maybe 6 feet across. The grass and lichen were crushed down evenly, like someone had placed a heavy object there and left it for a while. But I hadn't seen anything big enough to make that, and there were no tracks leading in or out of the circle. I made my way back to camp with the tapping fading behind me. The whole time, I kept glancing over my shoulder, like I expected to see someone or something watching from the tree line, but it was just the trees and the ridge. At camp, I checked my watches. I always wear two. And both had stopped at the same time, about an hour before I'd gotten to the hole. The batteries were fine. I'd checked them the night before. My GPS showed a gap in the tracking data, like it had lost signal, but there were no hills or obstructions nearby that should have caused that. That night, I lay awake listening to the wind whip around the cabin, thinking about the hole, the tapping, the flattened circle. The more I tried to explain it, the less it made sense. It wasn't like anything I'd come across before. No natural explanation that fit everything. The next morning, I packed up and headed back down the mountain, my mind still on those odd sounds and the hole. I glanced back one last time at the ridge, and the hole seemed to catch the sunlight differently, almost like it was glowing faintly from within. I don't know what made that hole or the tapping. I don't know if I was being watched or if something else was out there on the ridge that day. But I know that place felt different. Like the land itself had some secret it wasn't ready to share. I was just coming out of one of those long, deep sleeps you get after a few days of hiking and working around the cabin. I woke up to that weird Alaska quiet, the kind where the snow muffles everything but also makes every little sound sharp as hell. When I pulled back the curtain of the tiny window facing the clearing, I saw these impressions in the fresh snow right outside the cabin. And not just your regular animal tracks. They were big. Way bigger than a moose or a bear, and they weren't footprints exactly. More like these symmetrical indentations pressed into the snow, spaced evenly apart like some giant machine or object settled there. What really got me was that none of them led anywhere. No trails, no breaks, nothing. It was like whatever made them just appeared there and then disappeared without a trace. I rubbed my eyes, thinking maybe the light was playing tricks on me. But when I stepped outside, the cold hit me full on, and those impressions were still there. Clean edges, no snow blown in to fill them, like they were fresh and untouched. I circled around, trying to see if maybe there was something obvious I was missing, like a big animal that had moved away, but nothing. Just snow in those strange shapes. That's when I heard it, this faint, high-pitched whining sound riding on the wind. It wasn't steady, more like it would rise and fall, fading in and out, and it almost blended with the rustle of the spruce trees. I don't know why, but it set my teeth on edge. I'm used to odd noises out here, owls, the wind, the creak of ice, but this felt unnatural. Not loud, but definitely there, like it was coming from just beyond the tree line. I called out, hoping one of my neighbors might be close enough to answer, but all I got back was silence. I grabbed my old binoculars and scanned the tree line, half expecting to see someone or something, but nothing moved. No lights, no shadows, just the heavy, snow-dampened forest staring back. I went back inside, locked the door, and started going through the usual checklist: radio, stove, firewood. The whining got softer as the day went on, and by evening it was gone altogether. Still, I kept looking out, waiting for something to show up, or for the prints to change. It didn't. The whole time I kept thinking about those impressions, how perfect they were, like someone had carefully carved them into the snow. Next morning, I went out again. The snow had lightly drifted overnight, but those shapes were still there, almost like the snow was refusing to fill them in. I followed the line of impressions to where the forest got thick, and at the edge, the snow looked scuffed, but again, no footprints leading into the woods. Just this odd, compressed patch, like something had brushed the branches or the ground but hadn't left a trace. That day, I spotted something else, tiny flickers of light between the trees. They weren't stars or the northern lights, just small pinpricks of light, steady and pale blue. They blinked on and off, sometimes clustered, sometimes alone, and never moved toward me or away. Just stayed there, watching maybe. The whole thing made my skin crawl, but I told myself it was probably some weird reflection or electrical thing from distant power lines. Except there aren't any power lines near this part of the Chugach. By the third day, I noticed my watch wasn't keeping time right. It'd run fast or slow in unpredictable bursts. Same with my phone. The clock would jump, then catch up again. I started losing chunks of time too, like I'd be standing outside looking at those prints or the woods, and suddenly it'd be hours later, with no memory of what happened in between. I tried recording the whining sound on my phone, but every time I played it back, the recording was silent or filled with static. And that high-pitched noise, I'd swear it was there 1 second, gone the next. That night, I finally sat by the window watching the tree line. The blue lights were back, flickering faintly in the distance, and the snow impressions looked deeper somehow, as if pressed further into the ground. The air felt heavy, like something unseen was watching me from the woods, but I didn't see anything move. I was halfway through another cup of coffee when the power flickered. My cabin runs off a generator, and it shut off for a few seconds before humming back on. During that blackout, I thought I caught a glimpse of a shadow crossing just outside the window, but by the time I looked again, nothing was there. I packed up the next morning, wanting out of there. When I finally left the clearing behind, I looked back once more. The snow impressions were still there, perfectly preserved, no footprints leading away or toward them. I don't know what I saw or heard out in those trees. Something definitely made those marks, and something made that sound. But what? I can't say. And I haven't gone back since. I was flying the drone just like any other day out over the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, doing some routine survey work. My name's Jesse Malloy, been a drone operator and wildlife tech guy for a few years now, mostly up here in Alaska. It's a job that's equal parts boring and breathtaking, honestly. 1 minute you're watching caribou graze, the next you're staring at endless tundra and snow-capped peaks. That morning, the sky was that clear, pale blue you get in early spring, and the air was cold but not bone-chilling yet. I launched the drone from the edge of the tree line near the Sagavanirktok River, hoping to get some fresh shots of the caribou herd moving south. The plan was simple: a slow grid search, logging movement patterns, and any unusual changes in the landscape. I kept the controller close, fingers warm inside my gloves. The drone climbed steadily, rising above the low spruce and birch trees, then over stretches of snow still stubbornly clinging to the ground. I watched the live feed on my tablet, the little machine moving smoothly over the frozen patches and rocky outcrops. After a bit, I noticed something off. The drone's signal got patchy, brief flickers in the video feed, and the GPS reading wobbled for a moment. Not unusual given the terrain, but it felt different this time. Like the signal wasn't just weak, but being messed with somehow. I thought maybe a dead spot or interference from the hills. I nudged the drone toward open tundra and the feed stabilized again. Then, almost out of nowhere, the screen went black. No warning, no loss of signal message, just a hard cut. The tablet froze, then the feed disappeared entirely. I tried to reboot the app, switched controllers, nothing worked. The drone kept flying, but I couldn't see a thing. The map still showed it moving, that I'd slowly drifting west over a patch of snow and low scrub. I felt that familiar spike of worry. Losing video isn't unheard of, but usually the drone comes home or lands safely. I hit the return to home button and started watching the map like a hawk. Minutes passed, the drone inching back closer to the launch point. Finally, it touched down quietly in the snow not far from where I was standing. Relief hit me, but I stayed cautious. I grabbed the drone and checked for damage. None obvious. Everything looked normal. The weirdness started when I pulled out the memory card. My tablet had automatically started downloading the flight logs, but the video file was corrupted. I tried a couple of different card readers, software, even my laptop back at camp, but no luck. The footage was scrambled, data missing. Then I managed to recover the last few frames, or at least what was left of them. And that's when I saw it. A flash of something impossible, glowing softly against the snow. It wasn't like any natural shape I'd ever seen. Perfect lines and angles, like a geometric figure, but not flat, more like a three-dimensional shape hovering just above the ground. It almost seemed to pulse, the glow shifting slightly in color, from pale blue to a faint amber. The thing was too bright to be a reflection, and the snow around it looked undisturbed, except for a faint glow spreading outward like a heat haze, but cold enough that the snow hadn't melted. It didn't look like any kind of light I could explain. No vehicle headlights, no campfires, no aurora borealis effect. It was just there, for a blink in those last frames before the feed cut out. I went back out the next day with a GPS and marked the spot. When I got there, the snow was clean, undisturbed except for some animal tracks. Foxes, maybe. No sign of anything odd or that glowing shape. I poked around with my boots and even dug a little, but all I found was the usual rocks and frozen ground. What unsettled me more was how my gear acted that night after I got back to camp. My tablet and controller batteries drained way faster than they should have, like they were fighting some kind of interference. My phone lost signal for hours, even though I was within range of the satellite hotspot, and there was that faint high-pitched hum outside the cabin that night, barely audible, like a distant turbine or wind caught in power lines. I kept telling myself it was nothing. Maybe a glitch, maybe some natural phenomenon I didn't understand yet, but I still think about that flash, the impossible shape, and how the drone's feed just cut off right then. It wasn't random. I'm back in Fairbanks now, waiting on a new memory card to see if I can get any clearer footage. Meanwhile, the whole thing feels like a glitch in the usual routine, something just slightly off in the way the world should behave. And out there on the snow, maybe there's something watching, waiting. I was hiking near Lake Clark, out in that quiet stretch of wilderness where the trees thin out and the mountains start rolling into the tundra. My name's Wyatt Harmon. I do a lot of solo trips like this, mostly to get away from town and clear my head. That day, the weather was one of those typical spring afternoons up here. Chilly wind, but clear skies, and the kind of soft light that lingers late into the evening before the long twilight finally fades. I'd set off early, hoping to make it around a ridge that had caught my eye the week before. I was planning on camping somewhere near a small creek marked on my map, but as I neared the top of the last incline, I noticed something odd. Just beyond the ridge, tucked into a shallow hollow, a cluster of lights was drifting slowly. They weren't bright, just faint glows in blue and green, flickering softly like they were underwater or behind some thin mist. The shape wasn't neat or symmetrical, more like scattered embers on a slow breeze, but they definitely moved, drifting, circling, sometimes clustering, then stretching out again. I stopped and watched for a minute, the cold air sharp in my lungs. It didn't look like any campfire or flashlight. No other hikers were around that I knew of, and the nearest cabin was miles off. I pulled out my headlamp and gave a quick flash toward the lights, just a short burst. That's when things got weird. The lights shifted, not like a normal object moving away or toward me, but they seemed to respond to my flash, changing their pattern, drifting opposite to where I pointed the beam. It was subtle, but definitely deliberate. almost like they were aware, watching, or playing. I froze, trying to make sense of it. The lights didn't get brighter or darker, and they didn't sound like anything. No crackle, no hum, nothing. Just drifting, slow, quiet. I flashed the headlamp again, slower this time. The lights moved again, like they were dodging or reacting, but not in any straight line. They bent around rocks and trees, shifting angles that didn't match any wind pattern I've ever seen. I started feeling this strange tightness in my chest. Alone out here, with the sky darkening and those lights moving like some kind of silent signal, it felt different from the usual solitude. I called out, "Hey, is someone there?" Nothing but the wind answered. I kept watching as the lights moved, shifting positions, and then one by one they began to fade away, drifting farther behind the ridge until they were gone. I didn't sleep well that night. The next morning, when I checked the spot where I'd seen the lights, the ground looked normal. No signs of campfires, no footprints, no anything unusual, just untouched tundra and scattered rocks. But every time I think back to that night, I keep coming back to how the lights moved. Like they were alive in some way, responding. No idea what they were or why, but out there in the quiet, it felt like something watching me, waiting just beyond the ridge. Power went out just after dinner. Fairbanks can get like that. 1 minute everything's humming along, and the next, the whole neighborhood swallowed in silence and darkness. I'm Matt Olson, by the way, born and raised in this town, so I'm used to the cold, the long nights, and the occasional quirks that come with living up here. But that night was something else. It started about 7 p.m. I was sitting in my living room just finishing up a frozen pizza when all the lights flickered once and then died. No warning, no buzzing transformers or anything, just gone. I figured maybe a storm had knocked something out or the power company was having a hissy fit again. It happens more than you'd think. I grabbed a flashlight and went to check outside. The street was pitch black, the only illumination from the moon hiding behind thin clouds. No streetlights, no headlights, just the usual quiet that settles in when the city powers down. Then, from the corner of my eye, I noticed this bright light hovering maybe 30 feet above the road in front of my house. It was a sphere, perfect, like a glowing orb, and it wasn't moving at all. No blinking, no flashing, just a steady white-blue glow that lit up the street beneath it. At first, I thought it was a drone or some kind of spotlight from the neighbor's house, but everything else was dark, and there was no noise, no drone hum, no engines, not even the buzz of electricity like from a transformer. Just this silent light hanging there, like it was holding its breath. I pulled my jacket on and stepped out onto the porch, flashlight in one hand, phone in the other. I tried calling a few numbers to see if the outage was widespread, no signal. Then I tried to turn on the porch light. Nothing. All the electronics nearby were dead silent. I remember feeling this odd quietness, not just because of the blackout, but something about that light. It was so calm, like it didn't belong to the night at all. I pointed my flashlight directly at it and gave a quick flick, like a blink. The orb didn't blink back, but it shifted slightly, just a bit to the left, almost like it was aware I was there. I backed up onto the lawn, eyes glued to that glow. I wanted to call someone, anyone, but the signal was gone on my phone. The house phone was dead, and even the car key fob wouldn't respond. Then my digital watch stopped ticking. After maybe 5 minutes, maybe more, it's hard to say, the orb began to fade slowly, dimming until it was just a faint shimmer and then nothing. The power didn't come back right away either. It was still out for a solid half hour after the light disappeared. When the lights finally flickered back on, everything snapped back to life. The clock on the microwave, my phone signal, even the car key fob beeped like nothing had happened. I was standing there on the porch feeling like I'd just seen something impossible but completely silent. I never saw anything like that before or since. No fireflies, no drones, no planes, just that sphere, glowing, quiet, and then gone. I told a few people in town the next day, but most just smiled and said, probably just a weather balloon or some military testing. Maybe. But if it was, why did all my electronics die? And why didn't it make a sound? I keep thinking about how still it was, how the air seemed to hold itself tight around that thing. It wasn't threatening, but it wasn't normal either. It was like the whole world paused just long enough for me to see something I'm still not sure I saw. I'm back to the usual routine now, but sometimes when the power flickers or the night gets extra quiet, I find myself looking up, wondering if that light's still out there, just watching. I was flying a supply run out near the Aleutians. Just the usual stuff, hauling gear to a small outpost on Adak Island. Nothing fancy, no tourists or big cargo, just me, my single-engine Cessna, and the ocean sprawled out below, gray and choppy like it always is this time of year. My name's Cole Harper, born and bred in Anchorage, but I've been flying these routes for years, so I know these skies like the back of my hand. The weather was on the rough side that afternoon, clouds hanging low, gusts swinging the plane like a toy. Nothing I couldn't handle, but it meant I was sticking close to the coast rather than pushing out over the open sea. I was cruising at about 4,500 feet, scanning for turbulence pockets and keeping an eye on my instruments. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I spotted something odd. At first, I thought it was a weird cloud reflection or maybe a distant fishing boat with some lights, but it wasn't. This thing was moving, slow and deliberate, cutting through the wind in a way that didn't make sense. It was flying against the gusts, smooth and steady, not wobbling or buffeted. I banked the plane to get a better look. It was about a mile off my left wing, maybe a little further. The shape was all wrong for any plane I'd ever seen. No wings, no tail, no visible prop or jet engine. More like an elongated oval, but sharp on one end, with a dull metallic sheen that caught the fading sunlight just right. It didn't hum or roar. There was no sound at all, just silence. I called it in on the radio, the usual frequency for the route. Control, this is 9 Tango. I've got an unidentified aircraft about a mile off my left wing, bearing 080, altitude 4500, moving counter to the wind. No visible means of propulsion, requesting advisories. My voice sounded steadier than I felt. You don't get a look like that and stay calm easy. No response. The radio was quiet. I tried again, same words. Nothing. Just as I was about to switch channels, the static on the radio suddenly got louder. Then I heard voices, faint, layered, like a whispering chorus. The words were fast, clipped, and not any language I recognized. No English, no Russian, no Yupik or Aleut, nothing from the charts or my years of flying these skies. I blinked, thinking my ears were messing with me. I tried to respond, but my radio was suddenly dead. No signal, no static, just silence again. That's when the shape shifted. It didn't move in a straight line anymore, but seemed to float sideways, sliding through the air like it was underwater. Against that wind, impossible. Impossible. I banked hard to follow it, my hands gripping the yoke tighter. The strange aircraft stayed about a mile away, but it started to get brighter, like some internal glow. Not a light you'd use to signal or flash, just a faint, steady illumination from inside. The dull metal surface turned a soft blue white. I kept my eyes on it and noticed something else, the clouds around it. They weren't parting or swirling like you'd expect from an aircraft moving through air. Instead, the fog seemed to curl away gently, like the shape was pushing against something invisible, air or maybe gravity. I couldn't say. Minutes passed, maybe 10, but it felt stretched out, like time was dragging. The radio stayed silent except for that brief moment of voices, and I was alone in the cockpit with this thing floating beside me. Then, it was gone. No warning, no acceleration, no jet wash or anything. Just blinked out like someone turned off a light switch. I scanned the sky, but there was nothing, just gray clouds rolling in again. I switched the radio back on, tried to call base. Signal came back immediately. The voices vanished. I reported the sighting again, but the reply was just the usual: copy, maintain course and altitude. No other traffic reported. Like nothing had happened. I kept flying, my mind racing. I told myself it had to be some military test or experimental drone, but none I knew would fly like that, especially not without noise or any propulsion. And the radio voices? That's the part I still can't wrap my head around. I landed the plane in Adak with hands still shaking. No one else saw anything unusual, just the usual fog and wind. The whole trip back was quiet, with me staring out at the ocean, wondering what the hell I'd just been followed by. Since then, I keep thinking about that shape, the silent glide, and those voices coming through the static. I don't know what I saw or what it wanted. but I know it wasn't like anything I've flown with before. And yeah, sometimes I wonder if it's still out there riding the Aleutian winds just beyond the horizon. I was stationed out at the Tustamena Weather Observatory for the better part of 2 months that spring, just me and the gear out on the southern Kenai Peninsula. The place is tucked away on a ridge surrounded by dense spruce and alder, overlooking Tustamena Lake. It's about as remote as you can get without being off-grid entirely. No cell signal, no internet, just the radio for emergencies and whatever I could get from the old satellite uplink. Name's Emmett Pike. I'm a grad student, mainly focused on atmospheric science, but this gig was mostly grunt work, monitoring radiation levels, barometric pressure, wind speed, that sort of thing. The station itself was basic: solar panels, a couple of wind turbines, a weather balloon setup, and a weatherproof shed where the instruments lived. I was supposed to be here to collect data and send back routine reports. Nothing fancy. Most days were slow, the wind howling through the trees, snow still melting off patches, occasional moose wandering near the edge of the clearing. But in the evenings, especially when the light was fading, I'd sometimes catch glimpses of weird glows on the horizon. I asked around before I left Anchorage, thinking it might be the aurora, but the usual alerts said there was no geomagnetic activity those nights. One night, about 3 weeks in, I was finishing up a log entry, laptop battery low, sitting in that cramped cabin with the windows fogged from the chill. I glanced out toward the west where the lake stretched away into shadow and saw it, a brief flash of green light. Not like the aurora's usual curtain or waves, more like a sharp, silent flicker low on the horizon. It lasted maybe a second, then nothing. I rubbed my eyes, thinking maybe it was reflection or a plane's landing light bouncing off something. I double-checked the sky, clear, no clouds, no storms predicted. I pulled up the radiation monitor logs from that hour and saw a spike. Small but clear. The Geiger counter clicks went from a steady baseline to a rapid ticking for a couple of minutes, then dropped back. I shrugged it off at first. Maybe some cosmic ray burst or interference from a satellite. But the next night, same thing. Another silent flash of green, this time with a faint purple shimmer just beside it. The radiation spike was there again, same pattern. No storm, no aurora, just those quiet, brief flashes that didn't light up the sky, no sound, no wind changes. After a few nights, I started to feel that weird quiet creeping in, the kind you get in the backcountry when everything slows down. But this was different. It was like the world was holding its breath around the flashes. Sometimes I'd swear the forest just a little ways off the clearing stopped making noise during those moments. No birds, no squirrels, nothing rustling. Even the wind seemed to pause. One evening, I was out taking a routine measurement near the edge of the clearing, the sun dipping behind the hills, when the lights came again. This time brighter, closer. The green and purple flickers pulsed silently, painting faint colors on the low clouds. The radiation monitor went nuts, more clicks than I'd ever heard at once, like it was overloading. I pulled out my radio to call it in, but the static was thick and crackled with something strange, like low voices whispering words I couldn't understand. Not any language I've ever heard, just soft, layered sounds blending into the hiss. I flipped channels, but the voices followed me, always just on the edge. The hairs on my neck stood up. I dropped the radio and bolted back toward the cabin. The forest seemed darker, denser. The usual path I took looked unfamiliar, like the trees had shifted or the trail disappeared. I kept walking, but it felt like something was behind me. Quiet. Patient. Back in the cabin, I locked the door, checked every window. The lights outside had vanished, and the usual sounds of the night came back slowly, like the world was waking again. I tried to explain it to myself: radar glitches, radio interference, exhaustion. But it didn't sit right. I kept running the radiation data over the next week. The spikes matched up every time with the flashes, but nothing in the local weather patterns changed. No storms, no electrical activity, no aurora alerts. Then I noticed the instruments themselves started acting weird. The temperature sensors sometimes read impossibly high or low, only to snap back to normal after a few seconds. The wind speed gauge showed sudden gusts when the air was still. The GPS coordinates of the station on my handheld shifted by a few meters, then corrected themselves. One night, during another flash, I heard footsteps outside. Slow, deliberate, but no one was ever there when I looked. The dogs from the nearest homestead barked, but those were miles away. I stayed the full 2 months, logging everything as best I could. The flashes continued, always silent, always brief, always tied to those radiation spikes and strange instrument glitches. When I left, I felt a weight in my gut, a sense of something watching from the ridge. Whatever it wasn't natural, but it wasn't loud or violent either. Just quiet, patient, and impossible to pin down. Back in town now, the data's still a mystery, and the recordings of those radio whispers, well, I keep replaying them, hoping for something that makes sense. I don't have answers. Just those nights on the ridge, the silent flashes, and the feeling that some part of the world out there doesn't quite follow the rules. It started out as just another late winter snowshoe trip in the Wrangell Mountains. I'd been itching to get out for a couple days, away from the noise of town and the usual grind, so I packed light and headed up a side trail I hadn't been on before. Name's Jessa Cole, born and raised in Glenallen, so I'm no stranger to the backcountry. Snowshoeing this time of year is a pain sometimes. Deep snow, bone-chilling wind, but that's part of the deal if you want to feel like you're alone. The air was crisp, just below zero, with a steady breeze coming off the Chitina River Valley. I was maybe 3 miles from the highway, wandering where the trees started to thin out and the mountains loomed a bit closer. The sky was overcast, low clouds pressing down on the peaks, making everything feel quieter, heavier somehow. I was moving slow, boots crunching the crusted snow, when I spotted something odd through the trees. It looked like a small clearing, maybe 20 feet across, but what caught me was how perfectly round it was. Circular patches in the forest aren't unheard of, maybe a place where a tree fell or some animal's den, but this one was too precise, like someone took a giant cookie cutter and punched it out. Curious, I pushed closer and found the center of the clearing was a patch of ice, crystal clear and glassy, with no snow on it, which was strange enough. But the weirdest part was the way pine needles were arranged all around the ice, pointing straight out from the circle like spokes on a wheel. Not scattered randomly, not piled by the wind, but carefully aligned outward in neat little rows. I knelt down, brushing snow off one of the pine needles. It felt dry, brittle, but the air right above the ice was different, warmer. Not hot, just noticeably warmer than the freezing temperatures around. I held my hand close, and even though frost clung to the branches nearby, the patch of air right there felt like it was holding on to a faint heat. I stood up and listened. At first, it was just the usual creaks and groans of the forest settling in winter, but then I caught it, a low, almost imperceptible humming. Not like an engine or an animal, more like the vibration of a tuning fork or a distant power line, but quieter. I had to lean in close to hear it. I looked around to see if there was something I was missing, maybe a generator or radio tower, but nothing. Just trees, snow, and that weird little circle. I tried to keep it together. Thought maybe it was my brain playing tricks after being out in the cold so long. I set my pack down, took a swig of water, and looked again at the ice patch. It didn't crack or melt, but the surface shimmered slightly, like the light was bending weird, almost like it was a thin sheet of glass over something else. I took out my phone to snap a picture, but the screen flickered, dimmed, then went black. That's when I noticed the faint humming got louder for a moment, then stopped abruptly. I tried turning the phone back on, no luck. I fiddled with the flashlight app, which wouldn't turn on either. A slow, sinking feeling started settling in my gut. Something about this place was off, and I didn't like it. I grabbed my pack and started back the way I came, but the woods seemed different somehow, quieter, but also denser. The usual sounds of birds or squirrels were missing. Even the wind seemed muffled, like the forest was holding its breath. After maybe 10 minutes, I stopped to catch my breath and noticed the sun was dipping lower, even though I hadn't checked the time. My watch worked fine, so I pulled it out. Almost 2 hours had passed, but it felt like maybe 20 minutes since I'd been at the ice patch. That threw me off. I mean, time can drag or speed up when you're out in the wild alone, but this was different. I usually keep pretty tight track of my trip times. I shook my head and kept moving, trying not to let the weirdness creep in too deep. My phone still wouldn't turn on, and my GPS was acting funny, showing I was a few hundred feet off the trail, even though I hadn't strayed. Then I thought I heard footsteps behind me. Not animal, too heavy and slow to be a squirrel or bird. I stopped, heart pounding, and listened. Nothing. Maybe it was the wind shifting snow on branches, but I swear I felt eyes on me. I quickened my pace back toward the main trail, but the longer I walked, the more I felt like I was being watched. No sudden movements, no loud noises, just a presence I couldn't shake. When I finally broke through to the main trail, the forest seemed to relax. The sounds came back, the distant call of a raven, the scrape of wind through the spruces. My watch matched the time on my truck's dashboard, and my phone booted up once I got a signal near the road. I locked the truck doors, took a deep breath, and glanced back at the trees where that clearing was. The sky was fading to twilight, but I thought I saw a faint shimmer in the distance, like a light flickering deep in the woods. I drove home slow, eyes on the road, but my mind stuck on that circle of ice and the rows of needles. Something about it didn't make sense. How neat, how warm, how silent everything was. I keep thinking about the humming and how the time got all screwy and that feeling of being watched. I don't know what I stumbled onto that day, but I'm pretty sure it wasn't natural. Whatever it was there, and it noticed me, and I can't quite shake that. My name's Levi Kincaid, and I've been trapping around the gates of the Arctic for a good dozen years now. I'm from Fairbanks originally, but this patch of wilderness, somewhere near the Noatak River, is where I've always worked during the winter. It's a tough country, but I like the solitude. Most folks don't go this far out unless they're used to it. It's quiet, too quiet sometimes. That last run I made, I was checking my traps over 3 days, spread out along a stretch of spruce and birch. The weather was colder than usual, biting wind that made your nose sting through your balaclava. I carried my usual gear, steel traps, bait, a couple of snares, and my old Winchester. I wasn't expecting anything out of the ordinary, just hoping to catch enough for a good payday come spring. On the second day, I noticed something odd right off the bat. One of my traps, the one I set near a small creek bed, was smashed. Not just sprung, but bent out of shape, almost like someone tried to rip it out and dropped it in a hurry. The bait, which I'd carefully wrapped in fish skins to keep it fresh, was untouched. That stuck me right away. Usually, if a trap gets busted, the bait's gone too. Not this time. It was just sitting there, like whatever came by didn't want to touch it. I checked the other traps and found 2 more with the same treatment. Broken frames, bait left alone. Around those spots, the snow was disturbed in strange ways. Tracks didn't match anything I'd seen before, not wolf, bear, or wolverine. They were deeper and wider, but the pattern was irregular, almost like the thing that left them was limping, or maybe hopping. I sat down on a fallen log and stared at those prints for a good long while. My mind was racing through possibilities. Maybe some big moose crashed through, or a ravenous wolverine that decided to break traps for fun. But none of that made full sense. I had my radio with me, but signal was spotty, and I didn't want to waste battery calling in for nothing. So I kept moving, finishing my rounds with a tight knot in my stomach. That evening, back at camp, I built a fire and tried to shake the feeling that something was off. The sun was setting early now, and the sky was that deep, cold blue you only get this far north in late fall. The wind died down, and the trees stood motionless, like they were waiting. Then I saw it. At first, it was a faint glow just above the treetops, flickering slow and steady. I figured it was just my eyes playing tricks after a long day. But the light grew, pulsing in a rhythm that didn't match any radio code or emergency signal I knew. It was greenish, with a touch of amber, and it spread across the horizon in waves, like a living thing breathing. I grabbed my binoculars, aiming toward the glow. There was no plane, no satellite, no helicopter. The sky was clear and full of stars, Orion and the Big Dipper hanging low. But this light, it moved against the wind, slow and deliberate, like it was searching. I reached for the radio to try to report what I was seeing, but the static came first, a hiss that quickly turned into soft murmurs. Voices, but nothing English or any language I recognized. They didn't form words I could catch, just patterns of sounds that seemed almost musical, like someone humming underwater. The hair on the back of my neck prickled, and I lowered the radio. I wasn't sure if it was a trick of the equipment or something else entirely. I sat by the fire, watching the light pulse on and off, each wave slower than the last, like a heartbeat. Around midnight, the wind picked up again, stirring the snow in little swirls. The light vanished as suddenly as it came, leaving the sky darker than before. I checked my traps again, just in case. Nothing was disturbed this time, not even fresh tracks. The next morning, I found more traps broken in the same way, bait untouched. The tracks were there too, leading away from camp in a path that made no sense, zigzagging through the trees before disappearing near a ridge. I packed up fast after that. The unease was creeping in full force. As I hiked out, I kept glancing back at the ridge, half expecting to see those lights again or something watching from the tree line. I didn't see the lights again, not that trip. But every time I check my traps now, even closer to town, I can't shake the feeling that something's there, watching, careful not to cross a line. And the strangest part, my radio still picks up those murmurs sometimes, static voices that don't belong to anyone. Just a faint reminder that whatever was out there didn't want me to find it, but wasn't ready to leave either. My name's Pete Callahan, and I live in Anchorage. I'm just your average guy who's been into stargazing since I was a kid. Nothing fancy, just a decent telescope, a notebook, and a couple of star charts I picked up over the years. I don't have any fancy degrees or anything, but I know the night sky well enough to spot things that don't belong. This whole thing happened back in late September last year. Early fall, the nights were already getting long, and the skies out here were crystal clear, good conditions for observing. I was out on my back deck about 10 p.m. setting up my scope for a session. I usually pick out some constellations or track the International Space Station when it passes, but that night I was just scanning the sky, trying to catch something interesting. I spotted it right away, a tiny bright dot moving way too fast for a satellite or plane. It zipped across the sky from northeast to southwest in just a couple of seconds. At first, I thought it was a shooting star, but the speed was off. It moved smooth and steady, not a quick flash, and it didn't burn out or fade, just a steady, bright pinprick darting across the sky. Curious, I grabbed my scope and tried to track it, but by the time I centered on where it'd been, it was gone. Just black sky. I fiddled with the telescope's controls, trying to predict where it might go next, but it wasn't coming back. I was thinking maybe I imagined it until I checked my star charts. I've got an old laminated one from a local bookshop, plus a few printouts from online catalogs. I used those to recalibrate my scope and make sure everything lined up. That's when things got strange. Right in the path where I'd seen the object moving, there was this patch of sky that didn't make any sense. According to every chart I had, whether printed or digital, there shouldn't have been anything there. No stars, no nebula, no galaxies, just blank space. But when I zeroed in on that area through the scope, there was definitely something there. A cluster of faint points of light, densely packed, unlike any cluster I'd ever seen or heard of. It looked like a star cluster, but it wasn't labeled on any chart or catalog I own. Nothing from Hubble's lists, nothing in the NASA databases I'd pulled up months ago. I double-checked everything, restarted my software, recalibrated the scope, even swapped out the eyepiece. Same result. That cluster was there, glowing faintly but clearly in the exact spot where nothing should be. I figured it was some kind of glitch in the software or maybe a weird atmospheric effect. But the more I watched, the more I noticed that the object, the fast-moving dot, was traveling directly toward or across this cluster. It almost felt like it was headed there deliberately. I tried to take photos through the scope with my phone, but the images didn't come out right. The cluster just showed as a fuzzy blur, nothing sharp. The weird thing was, the cluster wasn't on any star maps embedded in my phone's astronomy apps either. It was like this thing was off the record, uncharted. The next few nights, I kept coming back to that spot. Sometimes the cluster would seem brighter, sometimes dimmer, but it was always there. And once or twice, that fast-moving object showed up again, streaking across the sky, crossing paths with the cluster. always fast, always too precise to be a satellite or airplane. I told a couple of friends at the local astronomy club. They thought maybe I was seeing a new comet or some kind of unknown satellite, but no one else had spotted anything. The club's main telescope is way more powerful than mine, and they track near-Earth objects regularly. No reports, no alerts, nothing. One night, about a week after the first sighting, I stayed out late trying to get a better look. The air was cold, that sharp Alaska kind of cold that sneaks past your jacket if you're not careful. I'd set up some extra lights around the deck, but I kept my eyes on the sky. That night, the cluster looked different, more defined somehow, and the fast object came through again. But this time, as it passed near the cluster, the stars seemed to shimmer and shift, like they were bending around something invisible. It wasn't a flicker or twinkle like normal stars. This was more like a subtle distortion, a warping of the light. I blinked a few times, thinking it was just my eyes playing tricks. But when I looked back through the scope, the effect was still there, and the fast object seemed to slow, or maybe just pause for a split second near the cluster. The radio in the cabin, which I'd left on low volume, suddenly crackled with static. That was odd. There's no signal for anything out there at night, just a faint background hiss. But that night, it broke into little bursts, like someone was trying to call out, but the signal kept cutting in and out. I sat there frozen for a moment, not sure what to think. When the crackling stopped, the fast object shot off again, disappearing into the black beyond the cluster. After that night, the cluster didn't show up again on any charts or in any online searches. The fast-moving object vanished too, no sightings in weeks. I kept checking the spot regularly, hoping to see either one again, but it's been quiet since. Sometimes I wonder if what I saw was some kind of new astronomical phenomenon nobody's discovered yet. Or maybe something else entirely, something that just slips in and out of our view. I'm still not sure what I was watching that night, just that it wasn't anything I can explain, and it didn't behave like anything I know in the sky over Anchorage. And it's the kind of thing that makes you look up a little longer, wonder what else is out there that we're not supposed to see. I was running the Snowcat on the Denali Highway just before the big blizzard hit last November. Name's Mark Jensen. Been working this route for about 5 years now. It's not fancy work, mostly clearing snow, keeping the road passable for the trucks and locals who need to get through. But out here, you learn to respect the land and the quiet. The mountains can be pretty unforgiving and the weather turns quick. You've got to keep your wits about you. That day started normal enough. I was about halfway through my shift, clearing a stretch of road just past Teclonica River. The sky was mostly clear, cold and crisp, the kind of blue you don't see anywhere else. I'd been running the cat slow, just breaking the fresh powder from an earlier snowfall. I remember it was one of those afternoons where the sun's low, casting long shadows across the snow, the kind of light that makes the whole place look surreal. I was halfway up a gentle incline when something caught my eye. Off to my left, reflected in the snow right beside the tree line, was this shape. At first, I thought that it was some kind of weather balloon or maybe a low-flying drone, but it wasn't moving, not a sound. It just sat there, perfectly still, and the reflection on the snow made it look like it was almost floating. It was about the size of a small truck, but shaped kinda odd. No windows or visible seams, just a smooth, rounded surface that reflected the pale sky back at me. The color was strange too, like a dull silver, but somehow darker than anything I've seen. The snow around it looked untouched, like it hadn't melted or been disturbed. I shut the engine off and leaned out the cab to get a better look. The silence was thick. No wind, no birds, nothing. Just that eerie quiet you get right before a storm blows in. I glanced down at the dashboard. The gauges were flickering. Weird. The radio crackled and went dead. The GPS screen blinked out too. I poked at the controls, but nothing responded. Just static and black screens. That low hum started then, real subtle at first, like the engine idling somewhere far away, but deeper and more constant. It wasn't coming from the Snowcat, I was sure of that. It seemed to vibrate through the ground, the snow, even the air around me. I rolled down the window a little to listen, but the hum didn't get louder or quieter. It was just there. I remember feeling that knot in my stomach, the kind that creeps up when the weather shifts fast or something's wrong with the machines you depend on. I wanted to reach for my radio and call base, but the static was relentless. No luck. I glanced back toward the craft again. It hadn't moved. If anything, the snow around it was strangely undisturbed. No tracks or signs of how it got there. That made me uneasy. Out here, everything leaves a mark. The snow, the animals, the wind. But this was just clean, like it had appeared out of nowhere. The sky started to gray around the edges. I figured the storm was rolling in sooner than forecasted. That hum stayed steady, low and vibrating through my bones. I turned the snowcat back on to get moving before the weather got worse. That's when the instruments totally went haywire. The engine RPM jumped erratically. The windshield wipers wouldn't stop swiping. The temperature gauge spun like a busted compass. The only thing working right was the headlights, cutting through the early dusk. I tried to keep calm, but I could feel the snowcat shuddering, as if something was messing with it from outside. The hum didn't get louder, but the vibrations seemed to grow heavier, like something pressing down on the whole machine. I decided to back away slowly, keeping the craft in my sight. The whole time, my head was on a swivel, eyes flicking between the dashboard, the sky, and that smooth silver shape. The wind kicked up suddenly, whipping snow across the road in thick sheets. Visibility dropped to nothing in minutes. The hum faded as the blizzard rolled in, swallowed the craft, the road, everything. I eased the cat forward, letting the plow scrape through fresh powder as best I could. The GPS and radio still dead. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching, but I couldn't see a thing through the storm. It took me nearly 2 hours to get back to the highway's main junction. When I finally pulled off the road and climbed down from the cab, the blizzard had settled into a steady howl. I looked back the way I'd come. No tracks, no sign of anything unusual. The snow was fresh, deep, and undisturbed, like the road had never been touched that afternoon. Even the trees along the tree line showed no signs of disturbance. I called in to base on the satellite phone. The storm was bad enough to delay all clearing operations, and the other operators hadn't seen or heard anything strange. The next few days, I kept thinking about it. I drove the route again once the roads reopened, stopping at the spot where I'd seen the craft. Nothing. No impressions, no dents in the snow, no sound, no vibration. I even talked to a couple other operators and a ranger stationed nearby. No one reported anything unusual. I told myself maybe it was a trick of light or a weird atmospheric reflection, but the gauges, the radio static, that low vibration, they weren't easy to explain. It felt like something out of place, something I wasn't supposed to see. And the way it vanished, like it never touched the snow, it left me wondering what else might be out there, quiet and watching, waiting just beyond the edges of the storm. I still run that road, same as before. But sometimes when the wind is dead calm and the sky is that strange pale gray before a storm, I find myself glancing toward the tree line, half expecting to catch a flicker of that smooth silver shape again. I was driving the snowcat on the mountain road outside Talkeetna, clearing snow for the forestry crew that was supposed to start their spring work the next morning. The sky was already gray that afternoon, low clouds creeping down the ridge like a slow-moving tide. I'd been up there all day, pushing through deep drifts and smoothing out the narrow road carved along the steep slopes. It's the kind of work where you're mostly alone, just you and the rumble of the engine and the wind out beyond the cabin glass. By late afternoon, the weather started shifting fast. 1 minute, I had decent visibility, trees lining the road, the snow packed tight. The next, a thick fog rolled in, the kind that clings to your clothes and seeps through every crack. Then the snow picked up, not heavy flakes, but a fine powder that whipped sideways and cut through the cabin windows with icy grit. I'd driven in whiteouts before, but this one felt different. The whole mountain seemed to vanish, like the road just ended at the edge of a blank wall. The GPS wasn't much help. It lagged, showing me where I should be, but not where I was. I slowed down, but visibility hovered just a few feet in front of the cat's treads. That's when I saw the eyes. At first, I thought it was a trick of the fog and snow, a reflection of my headlights on some icy patch, or maybe a trick of light on wet branches. But then the eyes blinked. Two bright, steady pinpoints, glowing faintly orange, fixed just beyond the tree line where the road curved around the ridge. I killed the engine, letting the cab fall into silence except for the wind rattling the frame. The eyes stayed there, watching. They didn't move or flicker like a deer's might. They were steady, like a pair of little lanterns set low in the brush. I reached for the radio and tried to call the forestry crew or the ranger station, but all I got was static. No crackle, no signal, just that hollow buzz, like the whole mountain was blocking the airwaves. I squinted into the snow, but the shape behind the eyes didn't become clear. The tree line was dark, the branches weighed down with snow, but no shape emerged, no movement, no rustling. I waited maybe 5 minutes, trying to keep calm and figure out if it was some animal or just my imagination playing tricks. Then the storm seemed to ease a little. The wind dropped, the snow slowed. I turned the engine back on, feeling that unease that comes when you realize something isn't right, but you can't quite say why. I edged the cat forward carefully. When I got closer to where the eyes had been, there was nothing. No tracks, no broken branches, no sign anything had been there at all. That part stuck with me. I know mountain critters, moose, wolves, lynx, they all leave prints in the snow. But that spot was just untouched powder, perfectly smooth, like the eyes were watching from somewhere invisible. I told myself it was some reflection, or maybe a fox's eyes caught in the light. But foxes don't stay still for minutes, especially not in a blizzard. I finished the run, trying to shake the feeling. Back in town, the radio came back to life, and the forest crew was already packing up from the day. They didn't believe me when I told them about the eyes, said I was tired or seeing things after too many hours in the cat. But I kept thinking about it. The way those eyes didn't move, didn't blink, didn't react when I made noise, like they were waiting. The next day, I went back up the road on foot during daylight. The snow was soft and fresh, no sign of any tracks near where I'd stopped the cat. The trees were quiet, no broken branches or signs of disturbance. I looked for whatever it was, but I found nothing. I didn't want to tell anyone else about it after that. I've worked these mountains long enough to know when you bring stuff like that up, people start looking at you sideways. But I still think about those eyes sometimes, just glowing there in the whiteout, watching and waiting for something. I was running a resupply route on the snow machine, hauling gear out near the Noatak River about 20 miles northwest of Kotzebue. It was late February, the kind of day where the cold bites through layers if you're not careful, but the sky was clear and the tundra stretched out wide and flat, all frozen white and endless. I'd been working this route for a couple years, nothing fancy, just making sure folks out on the trap lines and cabins got what they needed before spring showed up. The GPS on my snow machine was usually rock solid out here, the only thing I really trusted besides the wind and the sun's position. So, when the screen flickered and went black about halfway across the tundra, I figured maybe the battery was just low or the cold was messing with it. I pulled off the throttle, rolled to a stop, and reached for the GPS. It was cold in my gloves and the screen was blank for a good 10 seconds. Then it suddenly rebooted, but the map didn't look right. Instead of my position on the tundra trail, the marker was pinned on the frozen Noatak River itself, several miles south from where I actually was. I blinked and looked up, scanning the horizon. The river's about half a mile wide there, usually pretty smooth ice this time of year. It wasn't like I was anywhere near it. My gut told me the GPS was glitching, but something about that spot caught my eye. There was a faint flicker of light on the ice, far enough away I couldn't make out exactly what, but it wasn't the usual reflection of sunlight or the glow from distant cabins. The lights pulsed quietly like someone holding a flickering lantern or maybe a campfire caught in the wind. But the color was off, more bluish green than warm. I pulled the throttle back, heading closer to that spot. As I got nearer, the GPS suddenly switched back to showing my correct position, but the flickering light stayed there, just on the edge of visibility. I slowed down and stopped about 200 feet from the riverbank, cutting the engine. The tundra was dead quiet except for the faint hum of the snow machine cooling down. I turned off the headlights and stared out over the ice. The lights weren't moving, but they didn't feel natural. No flames or shadows, just that odd shimmer. I reached for my binoculars and scanned the area, but the glare off the ice made it hard to see details. The light seemed to shift, almost like it was breathing. I leaned back, unsettled. I checked the GPS again. No issues this time, and the signal bars were full. Still, the glitch stuck with me. That spot on the river where the lights flickered wasn't anywhere marked on my maps as a cabin or fishing hole. I decided I wasn't sticking around. There's always been stories around here about strange things seen on the tundra or frozen rivers, but most are just that. Stories. I was practical, cautious, and knew better than to get spooked by a few lights. I fired up the snow machine again and headed back the way I'd come. The sky was clear and the stars hung bright and low, but the quiet felt heavier now, like the tundra was watching. As I crossed back over the trail, I glanced behind me. The flickering lights on the river were gone, completely vanished, as if they'd never been there at all. I pulled into Kotzebue that evening, tired and quiet. I told the folks at the shop about the GPS glitch and the weird lights, but most just shrugged it off. One old-timer gave me a look and said, "Tundra's got its own ways, eh? Keeps things close." I kept thinking about that spot on the river and the way the GPS had acted. A few days later, I checked the maps again. There was no new cabin, no recent activity reported near that part of the river. Sometimes when I'm out alone, I think about that flickering light, how it seemed alive watching, but without a shape or sound. It's not the kind of thing you see and forget, even if you want to. I haven't gone back there since. I was out near Denali, camped just a few miles from the park boundary, doing a solo trip to get some shots of the late summer light on the tundra and spruce. I'd been at it for a week, carrying my gear, setting up near streams, and creeping close to moose or caribou when I could. I like the quiet, the way the world feels smaller out there. Just me and the lens and the mountains looming in the distance. That evening was starting out normal enough. The sun was dipping behind the peaks, the sky turning that deep indigo with streaks of pink and orange near the horizon. I was fiddling with the settings on my camera, trying to catch the last good light filtering through the trees. The forest there was thick, mostly spruce and birch, with patches of alder and some stubborn wildflowers. The air smelled cold but clean, with a faint hint of moss and wet wood. I was about to pack up and head back to camp when something caught my eye. A faint glow, drifting between the trunks maybe 100 feet away. At first, I thought it might be a flashlight from another camper or maybe a headlamp someone left on, but the glow was steady and pale, more like a soft ball of light than a beam. I lifted my camera and snapped a few shots, thinking maybe it was just some kind of reflection or bug. The light moved slowly, weaving through the underbrush and bending around tree trunks. It didn't flicker like a lantern or blink like a campfire. It was smooth and steady, almost like it was floating. Curious, I edged closer, careful not to make noise. The orb stayed just ahead, moving like it was following a path through the trees. I took more photos, switching lenses, zooming in as much as I could. The camera's shutter was quiet in the evening air. I called out softly a couple of times, but no response. No rustling or footsteps, nothing but the light drifting ahead, steady and calm. After a few minutes, the orb stopped near a fallen log, hovering maybe 3 feet off the ground. I held my breath, watching. Then it seemed to shimmer, the glow intensifying for a moment. That's when I thought I saw shapes inside it, vague outlines, like shadows or figures. Nothing solid or clear, just enough to make me blink twice. I lowered the camera and stared, but the orb was just a ball of light, nothing more. I thought maybe it was a trick of the light, or my eyes playing games in the low sun. I packed up slowly, keeping an eye on the spot, but when I looked again, the orb was gone. No sound, no movement, just the forest settling into twilight. Back at camp, I downloaded the photos and noticed the same thing. Faint, almost transparent shapes inside the glowing orb. I enhanced the images, tried different filters, but the shapes didn't clarify much. They looked humanoid, standing, or maybe crouching, but blurred and indistinct, like smoke or mist caught in the light. I asked the folks at the ranger station if anyone else had reported odd lights or anything strange that night. They shook their heads, said it was quiet up there, just the usual bears and wolves moving through. The next day, I went back to the spot with a friend, but we found nothing. No signs of campfires, no tracks, no way anything could have been there except the trees and the usual birds. I still look at those photos sometimes, wondering what I really saw. The forest was quiet that night, colder than usual maybe, and I can't shake the feeling that something was watching, or maybe just passing through. Either way, it was real enough for me to question everything I thought I knew about being out there. The morning had been thick with fog, the kind that sits low and heavy over the water, swallowing up the horizon and making everything beyond a few feet feel like a dream. I was out on the inlet about 10 miles from King Salmon, doing what I've done for most of my life, checking crab pots. The boat was small, sturdy, and familiar, the one my dad left me, and the engine's steady hum was the only sound cutting through the gray silence. It was just past first light, and the fog had rolled in overnight. I'd never been one for worrying about weather too much. This was Alaska, after all. Fog came and went like the tide, nothing unusual. But there was something about that morning that felt different, like the air was holding its breath. I was about halfway through my line of pots when I noticed it. A shape, or maybe a shadow, just ahead, about 50 yards out, drifting with the current. At first, I thought it was another fishing boat, maybe someone running late or just pulling gear, but there were no engine sounds, no waves either. The water around it was still as glass. I squinted through the fog, reaching for the binoculars. The shape was definitely a boat, at least it had the outline of one. No lights, no signs of movement, just a dark silhouette, maybe 20 or 30 feet long, sliding silently toward the shore. I checked my engine, running smooth, steady, nothing wrong there. I called on the radio to see if anyone else was out near me, but just static. The fog muffled everything. Curiosity got the better of me, so I throttled back and edged closer. The silhouette stayed just beyond where I could see clearly, and the fog was so thick I couldn't make out any details. No windows, no cabin, just a smooth, dark shape gliding along like it was part of the water itself. I tried to call out, but my voice sounded small, swallowed by the mist. I glanced down at the gear, everything normal. No boat could move that quietly without engines, but I heard nothing. No engine, no waves, no wakes. The silhouette kept drifting closer to shore, edging along the shallow water near the tree line. I was about to turn around, thinking maybe I was getting caught in some kind of trick of the light, when the boat seemed to slow and then just stop. I pulled in tight to the shoreline, engine idling low. The fog was so thick now I could barely see past the bow of my own boat. I reached for my flashlight and pointed it toward the silhouette, hoping the beam would cut through the haze. Nothing. The shape didn't react. It was like a shadow frozen in place. I killed the engine and listened. The usual calls of gulls and the slap of waves on driftwood had quieted to almost nothing. The silence was absolute, like the world had gone still. Then, without warning, the shape started to dissolve. I don't mean like it sank or moved away. I mean it literally thinned, as if it was made of mist or smoke, spreading out until it was just gone. I rubbed my eyes and looked again, but the silhouette was gone. No boat, no shadow, no trace of anything where it had been just moments before. I sat there a long time, not daring to move. The fog started to lift slowly, and with it, the sounds of the inlet came back. Birds, distant calls, the slap of water on wood. I checked my watch. 10 minutes had passed, maybe more, but the last part felt strange, like something was missing. I started the engine and headed back to the dock, my heart heavier than it had any right to be for a simple morning on the water. At the marina, I told a few old-timers about what I'd seen, but they just laughed it off, said it was probably fog and tricks of light. Maybe they were right. Maybe I was just tired. But since then, whenever I go out near that inlet, I catch myself watching the water more closely. Waiting, maybe, for something I can't explain. Name's Eric Olson. I fish around Kodiak Island, mostly salmon and halibut. Been doing it since I was a kid. It's quiet work, long days on the water, lots of time to think. Last summer, something happened that's been gnawing at me ever since. I still don't have any clear idea what I saw or what it means. It started on a slow morning out near the western edge of the island. The sea was calm, glassy even, and the fog was just starting to lift. I was checking my nets, drifting a bit, when I noticed something weird just below the surface. Not far from the boat, there was this huge, dark shape moving underwater, big enough to cast a shadow that stretched beneath the boat. It wasn't a whale or a bear swimming. I've seen plenty of both, and this was different. The shape was elongated, almost smooth, with no fins or anything sticking out. It glided along like it was gliding rather than swimming. What got me was the ripples. Usually, when something moves through water, the waves break and scatter all over, but this was different. The ripples were precise, almost geometric, like a pattern drawn carefully across the water. It was as if something was deliberately shaping the waves around it, almost too exact to be natural. I froze for a moment, staring. The thing didn't make a sound. The water stayed glassy smooth except for those strange ripples. I reached for my binoculars, but the fog was thick enough to blur the view, and by the time I focused, the shape was gone, like it slipped through the water silently and disappeared. I tried not to freak out. I mean, I've been on the water all my life, seen odd things, shadows under the water, strange lights at night, odd fish, but this was something else. I went back to my nets, but the feeling didn't leave me. Something about the water felt wrong, like the calm was a mask hiding something beneath. The next day, when I pulled up my nets near the same spot, I found pieces of strange debris tangled up in them. At first, I thought it was just junk, maybe some kind of marine litter, old bits of metal or gear lost by a ship. But this stuff was different. It was lightweight, silvery, with no rust or barnacles. The edges were too smooth, almost machined, but with no markings or signs of manufacture, like it didn't belong anywhere. I showed it to some other fishermen at the dock, but no one recognized it. Some joked it was space junk or old military gear, but none of it made much sense. I kept the pieces in a box at home. Sometimes I'd pick them up, feel the cold metal, and wonder where they really came from. Over the next few days, I noticed little things out on the water. The fog would come in thick and fast, just like that, and then vanish. My compass started acting up, needle jumping around like there was a magnet nearby, but there wasn't anything I could find. At night, when I was anchored, my radio sometimes crackled with faint static, but no voices. Just a low hum that I couldn't place. It didn't last long, but it was enough to keep me on edge. I told myself it was just the isolation getting to me. Being out there alone, with nothing but the sea and sky for company, it's easy to let your mind play tricks. But I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever I saw beneath the water was still out there, watching, moving just beneath the surface, silent and deliberate. I don't know what it was, and I don't expect anyone else to believe me. But I'm certain I saw something that morning. Something not quite natural. Something that left traces I can't explain. I packed up my gear after that week and took a break from fishing near Kodiak. The sea felt different now, like it held secrets I wasn't meant to know. Still, I keep those pieces of metal close, hoping maybe one day I'll figure out what the water tried to show me. Name's Luke Jensen. I've been flying small planes in Alaska for a little over 15 years now, mostly hauling mail and supplies to the tiniest outposts where the roads just don't go. Last fall, something happened during a routine flight that I still haven't figured out, and honestly, I'm not sure I want to. It was late September, and the days were already shrinking fast. I was flying from Fairbanks to a village called Tanacross. Real small place, just a few dozen folks, mostly subsistence hunters, and a couple of families who'd been there for generations. I was on a typical route, just carrying a mix of mail, packages, and a few groceries. Nothing special, and the weather was clear, crisp, typical fall day for the interior. I took off mid-morning, everything running smooth. The plane was my trusty old Cessna 206, nothing fancy but dependable. As I climbed above the tree line, I noticed something odd out my window. At first it was subtle, almost easy to miss. There were these bright white orbs, maybe the size of a basketball, floating just a few hundred feet away from me. They weren't blinking or anything, just steady, glowing white, and they moved smoothly in the air. What really got me was how they were arranged, like they were locked in a perfect circle, almost like a miniature constellation just hovering there. I did a double take, checking the gauges and making sure it wasn't a reflection on the glass or some kind of optical illusion. Nope. The orbs stayed in formation, circling the plane in a slow, measured way. No sound at all, just this eerie calm. I reached for the radio to tell someone, but the channel was quiet. No chatter from the village or anyone else. I tried calling Tanacross on the emergency frequency, but nothing. I glanced down at the controls. Everything was normal. The plane was steady, engines humming like always, but those orbs stayed with me, circling, perfectly timed, like they were watching. For several minutes, I just kept my eyes on them. I didn't want to do anything sudden or risk upsetting whatever was going on. The light was so pure and bright, but somehow not harsh. It lit the clouds faintly when I looked up. I thought maybe a drone or something, but out here? Not likely. Plus, the formation was too precise, almost mechanical. When I finally got close to Tanacross, I made my descent, still keeping an eye on the orbs. They didn't follow me all the way down, but they stayed visible until I was about 2 miles out. I landed on the gravel strip, taxied to the small airstrip building, and shut down. The village was quiet, as usual. I asked around casually about the orbs, bringing it up like a joke. Did anyone see those bright lights out by the plane? I asked one of the elders at the general store. He looked at me blankly, shaking his head. Lights? No, Luke. Nothing like that. A couple of other folks shrugged and said they hadn't noticed anything strange. I figured maybe it was just me or some kind of trick of the light, but something didn't sit right. That night, back at the small bunkhouse I usually crash in when I'm on these runs, I kept thinking about those orbs. I checked my log, looked for anything unusual in the flight data. Nothing. The next morning, the sky was clear again and I flew back without incident. No orbs, no lights. Since then, I've flown that route dozens of times. Never saw those lights again. But sometimes when I'm up there alone, the memory of those perfect white orbs circling my plane just drifts back, like something quiet, patient, watching without a word. I was out on Swan Lake with my buddies Mark and Dave, trying to get some ice fishing in before the freeze really set in. It was early November, cold enough that the ice had thickened up good, but not quite solid all the way through yet. We'd been checking the spot near that little island in the middle where the fish usually bite best. Pretty standard stuff, nothing fancy, just a few holes drilled through the ice, shacks set up with heaters, and some rods balanced on homemade stands. That day was one of those quiet, gray days that make the whole world feel sort of muted. The kind where the clouds hang low and heavy, and the trees around the lake look like black shadows against the dull sky. We'd been chatting about the usual, work, the upcoming hunting season, whether the snow was going to stick this year, but there was this stillness in the air that I couldn't quite shake. I remember Dave was the first to hear it. We were sitting in our little shack when he paused, eyes narrowing. "Did you guys hear that?" he asked. "Hear what?" Mark said, looking up from his bait. "That thump, like a heartbeat, but under the ice." I thought maybe he was joking at first, like when you imagine hearing things out here, when you're alone for too long. But the sound was there, a steady, rhythmic thump, 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 almost like something was pounding beneath us. We stopped what we were doing and listened. The shack was quiet except for the soft hum of the heater and the distant wind moaning through the spruce. Then the sound came again, louder this time. Thump, thump, thump. It didn't seem like it was coming from anywhere around us, but from under the ice itself. Mark shrugged it off, saying it was probably the ice settling or some wildlife moving around underneath. But it didn't feel natural. That rhythm was too steady, too deliberate. Curiosity got the better of us. We grabbed our augers and drilled another hole right where the sound seemed strongest. When the ice finally gave way, we peered down, and, well, that's when things got weird. Underneath the cracked ice, deep below the surface, was this disc. It was perfectly round, smooth, and had this dull metallic sheen, not rusty or scratched, like it had never been in the water before. It was way too perfect to be natural, and nothing I'd ever seen on the lake. No markings, no rivets or bolts, nothing to suggest it was man-made. We were all quiet for a minute, staring down at it, the only sound the faint drip of water from the hole and the distant call of a raven. The disc looked embedded just below the ice, but it didn't look like it belonged there. Dave broke the silence. Should we try to pull it out? I wasn't sure. It felt wrong somehow. Like disturbing it might mess with something we couldn't understand. But Mark was already tying a rope around it. We tried pulling, but it wouldn't budge. The disc was heavy and locked in place by the ice around it. The light had started to fade and the cold was creeping in, so we called it a day and headed back to the truck. The disc was still there, silent and unyielding beneath the ice. That night at the cabin, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing that rhythmic thumping in my head, like it was echoing beneath my skin. I even woke up once, sure I could hear it outside, but the windows just showed a thick, starless night. The next morning, when we went back, the disc was gone. No chunks of ice broken away, no signs it had been pulled out or dragged off, just gone, like it was never there. We checked the spot carefully, looking for any clue, but the ice was smooth and unmarked. I still don't know what that was, a piece of some old abandoned gear, something someone lost and never reported, or something else entirely? Whatever it was, it left that steady thumping in my mind for days afterward, like a pulse, keeping time with something I'll probably never understand. I was hauling a load from Anchorage to Fairbanks, the kind of long haul that makes your ass numb and your eyes glazed. I'd been on the road since dawn, and by the time I got near Talk, the sky had already turned that muddy gray you get in early fall up here. I figured I'd stop at the rest area just east of town to stretch and grab a bite out of my cooler. The place was empty, just me and a few crows picking at some trash near the dumpsters. I pulled my rig into one of the gravel spots, shut off the engine, and let the quiet settle in. It was the kind of quiet that feels heavy in Alaska. No city hum, no distant traffic, just the wind stirring the spruce. That's when I noticed it. A white pickup parked maybe 50 yards down the row, tailgate facing me. The weird thing was there wasn't a soul behind the wheel. No headlights, no running lights, nothing to say someone was inside. At first, I figured the driver had stepped away to pee or something, but the place was dead cold and fog was rolling in fast, thick, and wet, like someone dropped a blanket over everything. I went inside my cab to get my flashlight. When I looked back out, the truck's headlights blinked on. Not steady like someone flipping the switch, but irregular, like a stuttered Morse code, on and off, on, then a longer pause. It felt deliberate. I don't know why I got out of my rig and started walking toward it. Maybe curiosity, maybe the way the light was just there, flickering like it was trying to say something. The fog made it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. I called out, "Hey, you here?" Nothing. The headlights blinked again, like a pulse, then stayed dark for a moment. I stopped about 10 feet from the truck. It was colder than the rest of the rest stop, like the air itself was thicker there. Then the headlights snapped back on, but this time the truck just vanished. I blinked, and it was gone. No trace in the fog, no sound of a motor revving or tires moving, just nothing. I looked around, heart thudding, thinking maybe my eyes were playing tricks. I checked the gravel where it had been parked, no tire marks, no disturbed dirt, nothing out of place. It was like it had never been there. I got back in my cab, slammed the door, and locked it. I called my buddy Mike back in Fairbanks, telling him I'd just seen some weird shit. He laughed it off, said maybe I was tired or the fog was messing with me. But the weirdness didn't stop there. The rest of that night, every time I looked out the window, I thought I caught a flicker of white light moving through the fog, like the outline of that truck, but never fully there. Once, the radio buzzed with static, then a faint whistle that didn't sound like anything I'd heard before. No bird, no machinery, just a long, low hum, then silence. I stayed put until dawn, watching the fog lift slowly with the first light, but no sign of that pickup or whatever it was. I made it back to Fairbanks without more incident. Since then, I keep thinking about that truck and the way it blinked at me, then disappeared like smoke. No answers, just that quiet feeling that something was out there, like watching me through the fog. I'm Gabe Carlson. a field tech with the Arctic Wildlife Study team. We set up camp every spring on a stretch of tundra near the Brooks Range out past Prudhoe Bay. It's a rough spot, miles from any real civilization. Mostly frozen wasteland with low shrubs and snow even in early May. This was the first time I'd worked the tundra in late spring, when the ice is starting to thin but the nights still drag on long and cold. We were there for a week, tracking caribou and testing remote sensors. Nothing out of the ordinary was supposed to happen, but then it did. That night, I was on watch, sitting just outside our tent cluster, sipping coffee from my thermos. The others were winding down inside. The sky was clear, the stars bright but way off in the distance, and the air dead still. Not even a breeze stirring. I was looking out over the snow when I noticed something low and bright, just hovering maybe 50 feet from camp. It wasn't moving, not like a plane or a helicopter. It was this steady, almost unnatural white glow, brighter than any flashlight or headlamp, but without that harsh beam. It kind of lit up the snow around it like a big lantern, but with this weird evenness, no flicker or shadow. At first I thought maybe it was one of the satellite trackers we had set up, but none of those give off light. Or maybe a nearby campfire. But we were out here alone, no other teams near enough for that. I stepped closer, my boots crunching softly, but the light stayed perfectly still. The weirdest part was how silent it was. No hum or buzz, nothing at all. I called out to the others, but when I looked back toward camp, the tents were dark and quiet. Everyone was supposed to be inside by then, but it felt like a long time had passed. I checked my watch. It was 1:13 a.m. I blinked and the light suddenly went out, like someone had switched off a lamp. 1 second it was there, the next, nothing. I called for the others again, but there was no answer. I started back toward the tents, but as I did, my head felt fuzzy, like the air was thick, and my thoughts were slow. I stumbled a little, trying to shake it off. When I got inside, the guys looked up at me, surprised. They said I'd been gone for almost 2 hours. That didn't make sense. I could swear it'd been maybe 10 minutes, tops. I checked my watch again. It was dead, frozen at 1:13. I looked around and the others all had the same thing. Their watches stopped at the same time. We stepped back outside and the spot where the light had been was weird too. The snow was crushed in a perfect circle about 10 feet across, like someone had pressed down hard or maybe stomped around in a ring. But no footprints, no signs of anyone being there. Just the snow packed flat, unusual and out of place. We all felt off after that, like our brains were scrambled a bit. One of the biologists, Jessie, said she felt like she'd been dreaming but couldn't remember what about. Nobody could explain how the watches all stopped at the exact same second. For the next day, we kept an eye on the spot. Nothing returned, no strange lights or sounds. The snow slowly started to settle back into place, but that circle stayed there, a flat, unnatural ring in the middle of untouched snow. We finished our work, packed up, and headed back to Prudhoe Bay. Even now, I can't explain what happened. The whole thing was quiet and slow, but it changed the way I think about this place. The tundra, the long nights, and what might be out there in the silence. Sometimes when I'm home in Anchorage, I catch myself staring at the time on my phone or watch, wondering if maybe there are moments missing that I'll never get back. Name's Eli Thompson. I fish on the Yukon River just outside of Eagle, Alaska. Been at it most of my life, and while the river's taught me plenty about patience and the way the land moves, it's also given me a few moments that don't sit right, like what I saw one early morning last October. I'd been out before dawn, setting nets near a bend just north of town. The air was cold enough to make my breath puff like steam, but calm. No wind, just that thick silence that only a river this big can have in the early light. I like mornings like that, peaceful, nothing rushing. The sun was just barely peeking over the horizon, the sky still painted in blues and grays. I was tying a knot in my net when I caught something odd out of the corner of my eye, a shape sliding just above the water, moving downstream. At first, I thought maybe it was a heron or something, but it was too smooth, too low to the surface. No sound at all, just gliding. As it came closer, I could see it was a dark, triangular form, about the size of a small boat, but without the usual clutter. No motor, no wake, no reflection in the river. That last part was the weirdest. Normally, anything on water throws a shadow or a reflection, even in this dim light. But this thing, nothing. Like it was there, but not quite part of the world. I squinted, trying to make out details. The edges looked sharp, almost glowing faintly along the tips, but there was no blinking light or anything like a running light. It moved with a smoothness that felt unnatural. No bobbing, no shift with the current, just steady, deliberate movement. I grabbed my camera from the side of the boat, but by the time I aimed and tapped the screen, it was already passing the bend. I thought maybe I'd caught something on video, but the screen just went dark. The camera wouldn't turn on for a few seconds, then worked fine again. Strange timing. I nudged the boat forward, trying to keep the thing in sight, but it was slipping behind a bank where a fog had started to roll in thick and fast. It disappeared completely once it reached the mist. And I waited for a few minutes, eyes straining, but no sign of it coming back out. The whole encounter lasted maybe 2 or 3 minutes, but I was shaking like a leaf. Not because I'm scared of strange things, but because it just didn't fit. I've been on this river my whole life, seen all kinds of wildlife, boats, even strange weather. But something moving like that, without sound or reflection, and vanishing into fog, that's new. Later that day, I showed a couple of folks in town. One said maybe it was some new kind of drone or military gear, but no one around here's seen anything like that. And there's no base close enough for testing. The fog bank that swallowed it up was the kind that usually sticks to the water on cold mornings. Nothing unusual. Since then, I keep thinking about the way it moved, how the air didn't seem to ripple around it like it was part of the mist itself. Some nights when I'm out fishing or just walking by the river, I catch myself staring at the water, half expecting to see that silent triangle slip by again. I don't know what it was. Maybe something local, maybe not. But out there on the Yukon, sometimes things don't behave the way you expect. I was up in Alaska visiting my sister and her husband for a couple weeks last August. They're just outside of Palmer, not too far off the Glen Highway. I'd never been up that far north before, not even close. I'm from around Temple, Texas, born and raised. I'd seen pictures, of course, but being there in person was something else. Everything was bigger, quieter, cleaner. Even the way the air smelled was different. I'd wake up and just stand on their porch for 10, 15 minutes breathing it in like it was medicine. One afternoon, about a week into the trip, my brother-in-law, Jack, asked if I'd help him gather some deadfall out past his neighbor's property. He heats mostly with wood and wanted to get ahead for winter. It'd been rainy the day before, but the sun came out that morning and things were drying up enough to walk the woods without sinking into muck. We headed out a little before 3, him with the chainsaw and me hauling a tarp and a hatchet just in case. The spot was maybe half a mile back from the road, down a little ATV trail through spruce and alder. Ground was soft but manageable, mostly moss and roots. We took our time, stopping here and there to check logs for rot or bugs. About 30 minutes in, we found a good patch, dry, fallen stuff, and got to work. Nothing weird yet. Just birds, wind through the trees, the occasional squirrel cussing us out. It wasn't until we were wrapping up that something felt off. I remember Jack paused while cutting through a decent-sized trunk. He shut the saw off and tilted his head like he was listening. I didn't hear anything right away, just quiet. Then I caught it too, this low humming sound. Not like a plane, not that loud or high-pitched. It was softer, kind of muffled, like it was behind a wall or under the ground, but it was definitely there. It went on for maybe 10 seconds, then stopped. Jack looked at me, eyebrows raised. I shrugged. Could have been anything, I figured. Pipeline, maybe a snow machine way off in the distance. We didn't talk about it. 5 minutes later, we started heading back with a tarp full of split logs between us. That's when I saw it. Or I guess I should say, we saw it. We were maybe 20 yards off the trail, walking back the way we came, when I spotted something through the trees. I thought it was metal at first, shiny, curved, sticking up through the brush like a piece of a wrecked plane. I stopped and pointed it out. Jack squinted, dropped the tarp. We walked over maybe 50, 60 feet through some thick undergrowth. What we found didn't look like any plane crash I've ever seen. The thing was half buried in the ground at an angle, like it had come down and just sunk into the dirt without much of a crater. No scorch marks, no broken trees. It was shaped kind of like a teardrop, or maybe a beetle shell, sleek, smooth, metallic, but dull, almost a charcoal color. No rivets, no seams, no writing. Just one long, curved shape, maybe the size of a pickup. Not huge, but not small either. It didn't smell like fuel or oil. Didn't smell like anything, really. Jack didn't say a word, just stared at it. I walked around to the other side and noticed what looked like a crack or seam running partway down the middle. I didn't touch it. Neither of us did. The weirdest part? There was no sound. The forest went quiet. No birds, no bugs, not even the wind. After a minute or two, I said we needed to report it. Jack nodded, kind of slow, like he wasn't all there. We marked the spot with one of his gloves on a branch and headed back to the house. The whole way out, I kept looking over my shoulder. Jack called the troopers first, who bounced him to the FAA, who bounced him again. Eventually, someone gave him a number for some government agency. I didn't catch the name. And within a couple hours, two men showed up at the house in a dark Suburban. No plates. I remember that because Jack pointed it out to me before they pulled in. The guys were dressed like surveyors. Khaki pants, black jackets, no logos. Polite enough, but they didn't introduce themselves or shake hands. Just ask where we'd seen it and if we could take them there. So we did. It was around 7 by then. Still light out, just starting to turn golden. We hiked back in, same route, same trail. Took about 20 minutes. I was nervous, heart thumping the whole way. Not scared exactly, just off. We got to the spot where we'd marked the tree with the glove. It was gone. No metal, no shape, not even a dent in the ground where it had been. Just a patch of moss and leaves like nothing had ever been there. The branch we'd left the glove on was snapped clean off and lying on the ground. I stood there, just staring. Jack didn't say anything. One of the government guys walked the area with a little device in his hand that looked like a radio or scanner. No beeping, no reaction, just him sweeping back and forth like he was doing a job he didn't care about. The other guy asked us again to describe what we saw. Jack did most of the talking. I chimed in here and there. They didn't react, just nodded, jotted notes on a little pad. Never once looked surprised. After a few more minutes, they thanked us, turned around, and left. Didn't ask for photos, though we didn't have any, and didn't take our names. Jack followed them back out. I lingered for a second longer. There was something strange about the ground. Not dug up, not trampled, but the moss where the thing had been, it was flat, like something heavy had sat there. And there were these faint streaks in the dirt, like someone had brushed the forest floor smooth. That night I didn't sleep well. Neither did Jack. We didn't talk about it much after. I think it rattled him worse than he let on. A couple days later, I flew back to Texas. Before I left, I asked him if he'd gone back out there. He shook his head and said, "No point." Then he told me the trail was blocked now. Somebody had put up a no trespassing sign just past his neighbor's lot. Fresh barbed wire, too. Said it wasn't there before. He didn't want to push it. Can't blame him. I know what I saw. We both saw it. But whatever it was, someone got there fast, and they made sure it disappeared without a trace.